Welcome, dear horror listener. You're tuning in to Frost Radio, and I'm truly grateful you're here. Whether you're a longtime listener or just stumbled upon this channel, thank you for joining me for another scary tale. If you enjoy these stories, don't forget to like the video and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow and means more than you know. I'd also love to hear from you in the comments. Tell me where you're watching from, what brought you here, or even what kind of story you'd like to hear next. Your support keeps this channel going, and I appreciate each and every one of you. Now let's get into today's horror story. The cab of the truck rattled faintly as it pushed through the night, the snow swirling in ghostly patterns beyond the windshield. Inside, the heater hummed, fighting back the cold that pressed against the glass. Hank Callahan, a seasoned long-haul trucker with 30 years of winter roads carved into his knuckles, kept his hand steady on the wheel. His thermos of coffee sat in the cup holder, steam fogging up every time he unscrewed the lid. The radio murmured an old country tune, scratchy with static as the signal dipped between the mountains. It was near midnight on the Glen Highway, the long ribbon of road that cut through the frozen vastness of Alaska. The world outside seemed infinite. A wilderness smothered in snow, broken only by the dark smudges of pines and the jagged outlines of distant peaks. The headlights carved two pale tunnels into the flurries ahead, flakes spinning like sparks in the high beams. Hank had always liked this stretch of road, though it demanded respect. You could drive for hours without seeing another soul. Sometimes the silence felt like it had weight, pressing down on the cab. He'd been thinking about his daughter, grown now, living down in Seattle. Christmas was only a week away. He wasn't sure if he'd make it back in time, but the thought of her waiting with a tree lit in the corner of her small apartment kept him awake. The steering wheel vibrated as the tires rolled over packed snow. Hank adjusted his grip, humming along with the radio. A faint smell of diesel clung to his jacket, mixing with the bitter tang of the coffee. He cracked the window slightly, letting in a sting of icy air to keep sharp. That was the way of it. Hours of monotony punctuated by small comforts, music, caffeine, memory. The road unrolled endlessly beneath him, a gray-white path framed by forest. The night was quiet, the kind of quiet that swallowed sound. No birds, no wind, only the soft crunch of snow under tires and the occasional whine of the engine shifting gears. In the mirror, his own lights caught the frost crystals drifting down, tiny sparks that vanished as quickly as they appeared. Yet something about this night felt different. Maybe it was the way the snow seemed heavier than usual, a blanket that wanted to cover everything and keep it still. Maybe it was the sharpness of the air, or the way the trees leaned in close to the road, their branches black against the sky. For reasons he couldn't name, Hank felt a faint prickling at the back of his neck. He told himself it was nothing. A man alone too long with his thoughts could start imagining shadows. Still, he turned the radio up a notch. The road bent left, curving along a dark slope. As his headlights swept across the shoulder, Hank caught sight of something ahead. A figure. A woman. She stood near the edge of the road, her hair pale in the glow, her arms folded tight against the cold. A thin jacket clung to her shoulders, far too light for the kind of night it was. She wasn't waving, not thumbing for a ride, just standing there like she'd been dropped in the snow and left to freeze. Hank slowed instinctively, tires crunching. A hitchhiker out here in this weather at this hour, it was wrong. He eased the truck to the shoulder, engine rumbling as he rolled down the passenger window. "You all right, miss?" he called, breath clouding in the cab. She turned her head, slowly toward him. Her face was pale, delicate, framed by wet strands of hair that clung to her cheeks. Her eyes, wide and glassy, caught the light and seemed to hold it. She gave a faint nod, but didn't speak. "Where you headed?" Hank asked. "Anchorage," she said finally, her voice soft, almost swallowed by the snow. "Climb in then. Too cold for standing out there." She hesitated a beat, then walked toward the cab. Hank leaned across and pushed open the door. She climbed up, moving carefully, her fingers clutching the handle like they ached from the cold. She settled into the seat, pulling the thin jacket tighter around herself. "Thank you," she whispered, Hank gave a small nod, shifting the truck back onto the road. Wouldn't leave a soul out there on a night like this. She smiled faintly but didn't meet his eyes. Up close, she looked younger than he'd thought, maybe 20 at most. Her skin had a strange translucence, like it hadn't seen the sun in weeks. She pressed her hands together in her lap and he noticed they trembled. "You from Anchorage?" he asked, more to fill the silence than anything. She paused, eyes fixed on the windshield. "I was," she murmured. The answer struck him as odd, but he let it slide. They drove in silence for a while, the truck humming steadily, the snow thickening outside. Hank glanced at her once or twice, trying not to be obvious. She sat very still, as though holding herself together. Something about the way she breathed, slow, shallow, unsettled him, though he couldn't explain why. "Got family waiting?" he asked finally. Her lips moved, forming the shape of a word he couldn't catch. Then more clearly, "Not anymore." The words hung in the cab like frost. Hank felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air. He opened his mouth to ask more, but when he glanced at her again, his heart jolted. The seat beside him was empty. His hands tightened on the wheel, breath catching. For a moment he thought maybe she'd ducked down, or shifted somehow without him noticing. But no, there was nothing there. Nothing except a faint shimmer on the fabric of the seat, like frost etched into the cloth. Hank blinked hard, eyes darting between the road and the passenger seat. His pulse thundered in his ears. The truck roared on through the snow, the road stretching endless ahead. "Jesus Christ," he muttered under his breath, fighting the urge to slam the brakes. His knuckles whitened on the wheel. He drove for another mile before daring to glance again. The seat remained empty. Only the ghost of her presence lingered, traced in frost. The radio hissed suddenly, the music dissolving into static. Through the crackle, a voice bled faintly. A woman's voice, distant, half buried in the snowstorm. Hank twisted the dial, but the static only grew louder, the voice rising like a whisper pressed against his ear. "Cold," it said. So cold. He snapped the radio off, heart pounding. The silence after was worse. The miles dragged on, the road swallowing him whole. Every shadow in the trees seemed to move. Every gust of snow felt like a hand brushing the cab. The mirrors caught shapes he couldn't pin down, figures that dissolved when he turned his head. His breath fogged the cab, heavy and uneven, and then, as he rounded a bend, the headlights fell on a shape at the roadside. A woman standing in the snow, thin jacket clutched tight, pale hair blowing in the wind. Hank's chest clenched. His foot pressed the brake without thought, the truck shuddering as it slowed. She turned her head toward him, and he knew that face, the same face he'd just seen vanish beside him. "No," he whispered, voice breaking. Her lips curved in something, like a smile, but her eyes were hollow. She lifted a hand, palm open, a gesture half wave, half reach. Hank swerved hard, tires skidding on ice. The truck fishtailed, the trailer groaning as it swung. He fought the wheel, breath ragged, as snow erupted around him. For a heartbeat, the figure was gone. Then she was there in the middle of the lane, staring straight at him. Her mouth opened wide, wider than a scream should allow, a soundless wail frozen in the air. Her eyes gleamed like shards of ice. The truck thundered through her. Hank gasped, jerking the wheel, the cab rattling as the tires found grip again. When he glanced in the mirror, the road behind was empty, only snow swirling in the taillights. He drove on, his chest aching, sweat dampening his collar despite the cold. His mind raced, trying to reason, to deny. Maybe fatigue. Maybe he'd dozed. But the frost on the seat was real. The whisper in the radio was real. Anchorage lights shimmered, faintly on the horizon an hour later, blurred by snow. Hank pulled into a truck stop, hands shaking as he killed the engine. He sat there for a long time, the silence of the cab pressing in. The seat beside him was empty. Inside the diner, warm air and the smell of grease wrapped around him. He ordered coffee, his voice unsteady. The waitress, a woman in her 40s with tired eyes, gave him a curious look. "You all right, hun? You look like you seen a ghost." Hank let out a rough laugh, though it sounded more like a cough. "Maybe I did." The waitress tilted her head. "Out on the Glen? Folks talk about her. Young girl, hitchhiker, always trying to get to Anchorage." Hank froze. "They say she died back in '72. Car went off the road in a snowstorm. She never made it home." The waitress set the coffee down, her voice softening. "Drivers still see her sometimes. Say she's just looking for a ride she never got." Hank stared into the black surface of the cup. His reflection wavered, fractured by steam. His hands ached from gripping the wheel too tight, and in the back of his mind he swore he could still hear it, the faintest whisper drifting through static. "So cold," it said. Hank didn't finish the coffee. When he stepped back into the night, the snow fell soft and endless, erasing all tracks. He climbed into the cab, glancing at the empty seat one last time before starting the engine. The road waited, dark and silent. And though he told himself he'd never stop again, he knew that if he saw her, pale hair, thin jacket, standing in the snow, his foot would press the brake without him even meaning to, because no one deserved to be left behind, not even the dead. Snow fell in soft, relentless sheets, a curtain of white swallowing the road and sky alike. Raymond Holt adjusted his grip on the steering wheel, his knuckles pale beneath the glow of the dashboard lights. His 18-wheeler rumbled along the Dalton Highway, chains on the tires crunching against the frozen asphalt. The engine hummed steady, a low growl that vibrated through his seat and bones, the only constant sound against the deafening quiet of the Alaskan wilderness. Raymond wasn't new to this stretch. 20 years of driving rigs across the country had hardened him to monotony and silence, but Alaska was different. It was lonelier, hungrier. The trees leaned in with skeletal patience, the snow muting the world until he felt as if he were the last person alive. He flicked his eyes to the thermos of coffee nestled in the cup holder. Steam still spiraled from the lid, fragrant and bitter. The radio played faintly, a classic rock station hissing with static between notes. It was company, of a kind, though the songs wavered and faded as mountains rose and fell around him. Picture of his daughter taped to the dash caught the beam of his instrument panel. She was 12 now, braces, messy hair, grin wide as the summer sky. He'd promised her he'd be back by the weekend, safe and sound. Another run behind him. Just another paycheck to keep food on the table. He sipped the coffee, eyes squinting at the stretch of road illuminated by his high beams. The snowflakes looked like silver needles rushing toward the windshield, endless and hypnotic. The monotony was familiar, almost comforting. Just him, the machine, and the long road winding north. The silence thickened as the night deepened, broken only by the steady slap of wipers clearing away snow. Out there, beyond his lights, the forest loomed, black trunks rising like gravestones, branches sagging under white weight. Once a hare darted across the road, its shadow sharp in his beams before vanishing into darkness. Raymond adjusted the radio dial, hunting for clearer reception, but only static answered. A hiss, a faint warble of voices, then nothing. He left, it off, letting the silence reclaim its hold. The hum of the tires, the engine's growl, his breath fogging faintly in the cab, these were the sounds of his world. Normal routine. He thought of the diner he'd passed 3 hours back, a lonely neon sign promising warmth. He thought of the mechanic in Fairbanks who'd told him to watch the roads. Dalton has its moods. Old drivers said the same thing. The Dalton ate men alive if you didn't respect her. Raymond wasn't superstitious, but the way they said it always lodged somewhere in the back of his mind. As he rounded a bend, squinting through the storm, he saw them. A line of trucks. Ahead, 4, maybe 5. Taillights glowing red through the swirling snow, bobbing faintly with the movement of the road. A convoy. He blinked, leaning forward in his seat. Relief trickled through him. Out here, miles from any town, the sight of other drivers was a comfort. Didn't think anyone else was stupid enough to make this run tonight? He muttered to himself lips cracking into a tired smile. The taillights shimmered in the storm, glowing brighter as he closed the gap. He pressed the pedal, the truck groaning as it climbed speed. The odometer ticked upward, a flicker of excitement, company, maybe even a convoy he could ride with to break the monotony. But as he drew nearer, the lights didn't sharpen. They didn't resolve into brake lights or reflective plates. They floated ahead, always just out of reach, dancing in the storm. Raymond frowned, easing forward in his seat. His headlights painted the snow, but the trucks remained silhouettes, their lights pulsing like blood-red beacons. He could almost hear the rumble of their engines under his own, a phantom vibration rattling through the road. Then, as suddenly as they had appeared, they were gone. Raymond blinked hard. His high beam stretched ahead, carving a clean corridor, through the storm. Empty road, snow falling in untouched drifts. No taillights, no trucks, and no tire tracks. The Dalton stretched ahead, white and unbroken. Raymond's hands tightened on the wheel. His breath hitched. He leaned forward, peering, into the snow-choked night, scanning the ditches, the tree line. Nothing. Not a mark. Not a whisper of another vehicle. The hiss of the radio flared sudden and sharp. He jumped, heart hammering, before realizing he'd left it off. Static spilled through the cab, crackling like distant fire. Then a voice, warped and broken, slithered through, "Stay line." The words dissolved into a shriek of static. Raymond snapped the radio knob, killing the sound. His pulse raced. "Snow messing with the damn signal," he whispered, though his voice sounded too loud, too fragile. He drove on. The coffee had gone cold in his cup, steam long since vanished. He sipped it anyway, the bitterness grounding him. The heater rattled, struggling against the cold pressing in from every seam. Minutes passed, then hours. He wasn't sure. The storm thickened. The darkness pressed harder against his headlights, and then he saw them again. The red taillights glowed ahead, distant but unmistakable. A convoy identical to before, marching silently through the storm. His stomach twisted. He knew what he'd seen last time, knew the snow had been clean. Still, his foot pressed harder. On the pedal, the truck whining as it fought the grade. The taillights drifted farther. He pushed harder. His speedometer climbed, engine straining. Yet the distance never closed. The lights floated, unattainable, like lures dangling in the snow. The static on the radio hissed again, unbidden. This time he didn't touch the dial. He let it whisper. Beneath the crackle, voices flickered, low, murmuring, many at once. Words twisted and bled into each other, a language he couldn't place, but heavy, commanding. His throat tightened, skin prickling cold. The lights flared brighter. For a heartbeat, he swore he saw shapes. Trucks, yes, but wrong. Too tall, cabins stretching upward like spires, trailers narrowing into points, wheels churning without sound. He blinked and they were gone again. The road ahead stretched empty, unmarred, pure as untouched parchment. The voices fell silent, only the hum of his engine, the whisper of snow against glass. Raymond's chest rose and fell in quick, shallow breaths. He gripped the wheel, sweat prickling under his jacket despite the cold. The Dalton felt different now. Not lonely, not empty. Watched. The forest pressed closer. The shadows between the trees seemed to shift, a subtle movement in his peripheral vision. He tried not to look. He focused on the yellow lines of the road, on the steady thrum of the tires. His mind whispered explanations. Snow blindness, exhaustion, tricks of the light. He clung to them even as the hair on his arms lifted, even as the sense of pursuit thickened. Then came the horn, a blaring blast, deep and mournful, shaking the air. Raymond flinched, nearly jerking the wheel. The sound came from behind, from above, from everywhere at once. It wasn't his horn. He checked his mirrors, nothing but snow, endless white. The horn bellowed again, closer this time. His chest rattled with it, bones vibrating. His headlights flickered, sputtered, plunged him into darkness for one terrible instant before surging back on. And in that moment, when the road was briefly revealed again, the convoy was there, directly ahead. A line of trucks, silent, massive, their taillights burning like coals. No drivers visible, no markings, just hulking shadows marching in perfect unison. Raymond slammed the brakes. Tires screamed, chains sparking against ice. The cab lurched, his coffee spilling across the dash, his seatbelt locking against his chest. The road howled beneath him. Shio, convoy didn't move. His truck skidded, fishtailing, the trailer bucking like a wild beast. He fought the wheel, veins bulging in his neck, the roar of his breath mixing with the screech of metal and snow. Then silence. The road was empty. Raymond sat frozen, chest heaving, sweat dripping down his spine. The wheel trembled under his grip. No trucks, no lights. Just white road stretching into forever, untouched by anything but his own tracks. He wiped his mouth with a shaking hand. His eyes stung. His body felt hollowed out. The radio whispered again. A single voice, clear this time, filled the cab. Keep your place in line. The air in the cab thickened, suffocating. His breath came shallow, panicked. He reached for the radio dial, but the knob seared his fingers. He yelped, jerking his hand back, the skin blistering red as if burned. The voice chuckled, a low sound, like tires crunching snow. Raymond shoved the gear into drive. He pressed the pedal. The truck lurched forward, heavy, stubborn, but it moved. He didn't look in the mirrors. He didn't look at the trees. He focused only on the road ahead, white swallowing white. Hours later, minutes, years, he couldn't tell. The storm broke. The sky above thinned, revealing stars cold and sharp. The forest fell back. The road stretched clean, harmless, silent. Raymond's hands loosened on the wheel. His body sagged with exhaustion. He reached again for his thermos, but it was empty. He hadn't finished it. He couldn't remember drinking. The radio was quiet. The picture of his daughter smiled from the dash. He touched it with trembling fingers. By the time he reached Fairbanks, the sun had risen. He parked at the depot, climbing down on unsteady legs. The dispatcher squinted at him, confused. "You made good time," the man said. "But strange thing, state logs show no one else made that run last night. Road was closed after a rock slide. You sure you didn't turn back?" Raymond stared at him, lips parted. He wanted to argue, to explain, to tell him about the convoy. But when he glanced back at his truck, he froze. There, etched faintly into the snow on his trailer, were long, parallel lines, like the marks of unseen wheels riding beside him all night, and beneath the chill of morning he swore he still heard it, that distant, mournful horn, calling him to take his place in line. Snow fell in sheets, not flakes, swallowing the narrow Alaskan highway like a curtain drawn across the world. The dashboard clock glowed 11:47 p.m., its green digits the only constant light besides the swaying beams of the headlights. Evan Whitlock had been driving for 10 hours straight, pushing through miles of frozen wilderness. His thermos of gas station coffee long emptied and the radio sputtering with more static than music. His wipers fought a losing battle against the snow, smearing streaks of white across the windshield as the heater wheezed. He rubbed at his tired eyes, blinked hard, and adjusted his grip on the steering wheel. He had taken this route before. An endless two-lane stretch flanked by towering spruces heavy with snow. Tonight felt different, though. The storm had come in faster than forecasted, thickening into a near whiteout. Even with the high beams on, he could barely see beyond the reach of his hood ornament. Each passing mile felt like driving deeper into a tunnel made of shifting white, his world reduced to glass, snow, and the low hum of tires grinding slush. His thoughts drifted. He pictured the small motel bed waiting for him in Fairbanks, with 5 scratchy blankets and maybe a hot shower if the pipes weren't frozen. He thought about calling his sister to let her know he'd made it, but his phone signal had already vanished 100 miles back. The last voicemail from her still rang, in his ears. Something ordinary, asking if he'd remember to bring her some smoked salmon from town. He smiled faintly at the thought, almost comforted by the banality of it. The heater rattled again, coughing warm air that barely fought off the chill creeping through the cab. Steam rose faintly from his last sip of coffee, the bitter taste still. lingering on his tongue. Outside, the storm roared, but inside the cab it was a cocoon of mechanical hums, muted warmth, and solitude. He flicked the radio dial absently, catching a warbled fragment of a country song before it dissolved into static. His thumb tapped the wheel in rhythm with the hiss, half-heartedly, as though pretending there was music at all. The night carried on like that. Endless snow, faint static, heavy eyes. His world had narrowed into a ritual of wipers, hum, and headlights, until a sudden gust shoved the truck sideways, tires skidding. He jerked the wheel, overcorrected, and with a grunt, guided it back into line. His breath came fast, fogging the glass. He realized then how dangerous it was, alone in a storm, visibility gone. He needed to pull over before fatigue or the weather got him killed. He spotted a vague shoulder ahead, nothing more than a darker patch of road swallowed by white. With care, he guided the truck onto it, easing to a stop. The engine idled. He leaned back, exhaled, and let the silence of the storm close around him. For a moment it was peace. Snow blanketed everything outside, soft and consuming, muting the world like a padded cell. The cab ticked faintly with cooling metal, the defroster sighing against the windshield. Evan closed his eyes, telling himself he'd just rest them for a second, let the storm ease. That was when the knock came. 3 sharp raps on the glass, deliberate, measured, directly in front of his face. Evan's eyes flew open, his whole body stiffened, lungs locked. He whipped his head toward the windshield. Nothing. Just a moving curtain of snow in the beam of the headlights. He leaned forward slowly, peering past the smeared wiper arcs. The storm swirled thick as cotton, erasing everything beyond a few feet. There was no figure, no outline, no hint of movement. His heart pounded in his chest, every thump loud in the confined cab. He grabbed the flashlight from the passenger seat and flicked it on. Its beam stabbed forward, catching only flakes rushing like insects toward glass. Empty. Silent. He sat back, laughless breath escaping him. Snow hitting the glass, he muttered. That's all. A branch maybe, ice. His voice felt too loud inside the cab. He checked the locks instinctively, pressing each knob down with his thumb. All secure. The defroster hissed louder as he turned the dial up. Warm air blew against the windshield, melting thin layers of frost. Slowly, a pattern emerged, faint at first, then unmistakable. A handprint. Massive. Stretched wide across the inside of the windshield. Evan froze. The outline was too large to be his, the fingers too long. It hadn't been there before. He'd been watching the frost, rubbing it away, staring through this very glass. He lifted his own hand, pressed it near the mark. His fingers looked childlike in comparison. The frost melted around the shape, retreating into water trails, but the handprint remained. Embedded, etched, as though the glass itself remembered the touch. His skin crawled. He wiped at it with his sleeve, frantic, but the print didn't smear, didn't fade. The heater's breath fogged around it, yet the mark clung, perfect, unchanging. A coldness spread through his chest that no defroster could fight. He thought of the knock again. 3 deliberate raps, inches from his face. And then this. He turned, the key ready to gun the truck forward, storm be damned. But the engine coughed, sputtered, and choked into silence. Dashboard lights flickered out. The cab went black except for the pale headlights dying into white nothingness. Evan's breath quickened, fog blooming in the darkness. He gripped the wheel, feeling the blood drain from his fingers. A sound drifted then, not from the storm outside, but from inside the cab itself. A faint creak, like leather shifting. Then another knock, not on the windshield this time, from behind him. His neck stiffened, every muscle screaming against the urge to turn. The rearview mirror loomed above, catching only darkness. His hand shook as he reached for the flashlight, thumb trembling over the switch. When the beam shot back, it illuminated only the empty bench seat, the rumpled jacket he'd tossed earlier. the frost creeping faintly at the edges of the back window. Nothing more. But the air was wrong. Thick. Heavy. As though the truck had gained another passenger. He couldn't see. The silence between his breaths deepened, stretching taut until it hummed in his ears. The handprint remained, gleaming faintly in the weak light, refusing to vanish. Panic clawed at his chest. He twisted the key again. Engine dead. He pounded the wheel. Snow slapped against the roof in bursts. In the chaos of his heartbeat and breath, he swore he heard it. Another knock. Slow. Patient. This time it came from the passenger side window. He snapped his head toward it. Nothing but white pressed against the glass. He leaned close, light shaking in his grip. His own reflection stared back, wide-eyed, pale. Then slowly, a second handprint bloomed beside his reflection, forming not from frost this time, but from condensation, as though something inside the cab pressed against the glass. A palm, fingers long, stretching, flattening against the surface. Evan recoiled, dropping the flashlight, its beam spinning wildly across the cab. His breath came in ragged bursts, his chest tightening. He fumbled for the door handle, hesitated. The storm outside was lethal, blinding cold, disorientation certain. But the storm wasn't knocking. Something else was. The glass groaned faintly as the pressure of the unseen hand lingered. Evan's pulse thundered. He shoved the handle and burst into the storm, snow instantly searing his face with icy needles. He staggered, nearly falling as his boots sank into drifts. The wind howled, disorienting him, turning every direction, into white void. Behind him the truck sat half-buried, headlights dim. The cab glowed faintly, shapes shifting across its frosted glass in ways that didn't match the storm. He blinked snow from his lashes, heart hammering, unsure if he was seeing right. Then, 3 sharp knocks echoed, muffled by snow but clear as bone on glass. The sound came not from the truck now, but from nowhere. From everywhere. Evan staggered, backward, arms raised against the blizzard. He spun in circles, searching for figures, silhouettes, anything human. Nothing. Only the storm, infinite and swallowing. The sound repeated. Knock, knock, knock. He turned toward the truck one last time. Through the frost-smeared windshield in the faint glow, the handprint remained. Only now it wasn't alone. 6 more prints spread across the inside glass, overlapping, reaching, pressing outward. Each one impossibly large, fingers splayed wide as if testing the barrier between in and out. His scream ripped into the storm, carried off instantly by the wind. When morning came, the storm eased, and the highway emerged again. Plows rolled through, clearing drifts, their drivers barely noticing the abandoned truck on the shoulder. They radioed it in, noted the frost, and ice sealing the cab. Inside there was no Evan Whitlock, only the windshield perfectly clear except for a single lingering handprint pressed from within. The Seward Highway stretched out before them like a ribbon of asphalt swallowed by the Alaskan wilderness. Snow-dusted peaks rose black against the bruised sky, their jagged outlines fading into dusk. Inside the SUV, warm air hummed through the vents, fogging the edges of the windshield where frost had begun to creep. Mark tightened his grip on the steering wheel, glancing in the rearview mirror at his kids in the back. Ellie, the older one at 12, sat hunched over her sketchbook with earbuds dangling from her ears, the tip of her pencil dancing across the page. Sam, only 8, had curled up with a blanket, his small head resting against the glass, every bump in the road rocking him into half-sleep. Beside Mark in the passenger seat, his wife Claire sipped from a paper cup of gas station coffee, steam unfurling in the glow of the dashboard. The radio played softly, static-dusted country music broken by bursts of silence as the mountains interfered with the signal. The road signs had grown sparser the farther they drove, pointing the way toward Seward, where their rented cabin by the water waited. Mark felt that rare road trip contentment, a sense of being sealed in a bubble. With his family, the rest of the world reduced to headlights bouncing off snowy trees and the low hum of tires against ice. He stretched his fingers, flexing out the ache of the long drive. The kids were quiet, the coffee was hot, and the night was still young. The kind of ordinary, easy moment you never realized you'd remember. Outside, the Alaskan dusk thickened, pressing in with a silence so heavy it felt like they were the last people on Earth. The SUV cut through the stillness, the steady sweep of headlights catching banks of snow piled along the roadside. Frozen rivers glimmered faintly beyond the trees, their surfaces gleaming like dull glass under the sinking sun. For long stretches, there were no other cars, no taillights or beams to break the dark. Just them, surrounded by forest and mountain, a thread of highway unspooling between two endless voids. Claire leaned her head against the seat, her eyes closing in the rhythm of the drive. Sam snored softly, his breath fogging a patch of window, while Ellie's pencil scratched faintly as she shaded the outline of something Mark couldn't quite make out. A deer, maybe, or a mountain. Mark rolled his shoulders, his gaze flicking between the yellow lines and the trees. They seemed to lean closer with each mile, crowding the edges of the road. The quiet was almost too perfect, too absolute, broken only by the occasional whisper of wind tunneling through the mountains. Then, faintly, something flickered. At first he thought it was a trick of the windshield glare, a reflection from his own headlights. But it came again, weaving between the trunks of spruce, a cold blue light thin and quick like a wisp of flame. He blinked and leaned forward, eyes narrowing. By the time he tried to point it out to Claire, it was gone. He told himself it was nothing. Aurora, maybe, though he knew the lights weren't forecast tonight. Half an hour later, Sam stirred. "Dad," he mumbled, rubbing his eyes. "What's that outside?" Mark followed the boy's finger to the tree line. The blue light was back, moving in a way no flashlight or headlamp should. It darted between branches, then stopped, hovering, as if watching the car. Claire sat upright, frowning. "Do you see that?" she whispered. Before Mark could answer, a second light appeared, then a third, both pale and wavering. They floated like lanterns caught in a current slipping through the trees in eerie synchronization. "Maybe Aurora's low on the horizon," Mark said, though the words felt hollow. Ellie finally looked up from her sketchbook. "That's not how auroras move." Her voice was flat, certain. The lights vanished as suddenly as they'd come. Mark exhaled, tension leaking from his shoulders. Just tricks of the eye. His headlights had probably caught patches of snow. That was all. But 10 minutes later, they were back. This time the lights kept pace with the car. The air inside the SUV thickened, each breath frosting slightly despite the heater. The radio signal faltered, fading into a wash of static before, spiking with a distorted hum that rattled through the speakers. The lights danced along the roadside now, threading between trunks as if tethered to the family's journey. One surged ahead, weaving across the road before darting back into the forest. Mark's knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. He told himself to keep going, to ignore it, but his chest had gone tight. He slowed the car unconsciously, the tires crunching louder over packed snow. "Mark," Claire whispered, "pull over, just for a minute." He wanted to argue, but something in her tone, something tight and fearful, forced him to comply. He guided the SUV onto a small turnout, gravel crunching under the tires as the headlights swept across a snowbank. The engine idled, steam curling from the hood in the freezing night. And then the lights came closer. They glowed brighter than before, cobalt flames licking across the trees, slipping between branches without resistance. One hovered directly in front of the windshield, a trembling sphere no larger than a fist, pulsing in and out like a heartbeat. Sam whimpered. Claire reached for his hand. Ellie, wide-eyed, pulled her sketchbook into her lap and, without a word, began to draw. Mark gritted his teeth. "It's just some kind of phenomenon. Ball lightning, maybe." The light flared in response, as if offended. The SUV's engine sputtered. The dashboard lights dimmed, flickered, then glowed weakly. Mark slammed the accelerator, but the engine only groaned before choking into silence. The sudden absence of the motor's hum was deafening, leaving only their breathing and the faint hiss of wind through the cracks. Outside, the blue orbs multiplied, circling the car in slow, deliberate, arcs. Their glow painted the snow a ghostly blue, shadows twisting and stretching across the drifts. Sam began to cry, a thin, stifled sound. Claire pulled him close, whispering that it would be okay, though her eyes betrayed no such belief. Mark tried the ignition again. Nothing but a dull click. He muttered under his breath, his voice cracking against the silence. The orbs pressed closer, their pulsing synchronized. The air grew heavy, static, crawling along the skin. Mark's arm hairs rose as if drawn by invisible electricity. Ellie's pencil scratched frantically, capturing the round glow, the dark forest, the way the light seemed alive. She looked up at her father with something unreadable in her expression. Fear, yes, but also fascination. The lights tightened their circle, each pulse blinding, like the strobe of a camera flash. Blue flooded the cabin, washing out their faces, turning their eyes into black hollows. The air smelled faintly of ozone, sharp and metallic. Claire shouted, "Mark!" As the roof of the SUV groaned, a pressure descending from nowhere, making their ears pop. The lights pressed so close they touched the glass. One pressed against Sam's window, its glow crawling over his blanket. He buried his face into his mother's coat. The battery monitor on the dashboard blinked once, then went dark. Every ounce of power in the car was gone. Mark's breaths came ragged. He wanted to run, to tear open the door and flee into the forest. But the thought of leaving, the car was worse than staying inside. He pressed his palm against the steering wheel, useless beneath his hand, a dead weight of plastic and steel. The orbs moved faster now, spiraling tighter, a cyclone of light. The air vibrated with an unearthly hum, not heard so much as felt deep, in their bones. Each pulse seemed to tug at his chest, like invisible hands squeezing his heart. Claire cried out as her phone slipped from her lap and the screen went black. Ellie's sketchbook slid from her knees, pages riffling as though stirred by unseen fingers. The orbs blazed, brighter than headlights, swallowing every shadow until all that remained was the suffocating blue. And then, just as suddenly as it began, everything stopped. The lights winked out. The hum ceased. The night fell into silence so thick it rang in their ears. They sat in darkness, the forest swallowing them whole. By morning, when the first pale wash of dawn seeped across the peaks, Mark tried the ignition again. The SUV didn't even click. Every ounce of power was drained, the battery dead, the radio silent. Their breaths hung pale in the cold air, the windows fogged from the night they'd endured in silence. When a passing truck finally stopped to help, the driver eyed the family's pale faces, the dead battery, and the strange sketches Ellie clutched in her lap. He offered them a jump without questions. Later at the cabin, Mark searched weather reports, aurora forecasts, any rational scrap to hold on to. But no auroras had been recorded that night, not even faint ones. Ellie left her sketchbook open on the table, the drawing stark in graphite, blue orbs weaving through black trees, a circle tightening around a car, and one final image that made Mark's blood run cold, an orb pressed against the glass, its glow forming the faint outline of a face inside. He shut the book quickly, telling himself it was only a child's imagination. But even now, when he closed his eyes, he swore he could feel the hum still in his chest, faint but steady, like something watching from just beyond the tree line, waiting for the next family to stop on the Seward Highway. Snow fell in tired, thin flakes that clung to the windshield before being brushed away by the wipers. The nurse adjusted her grip on the steering wheel and flexed her stiff fingers, feeling the ache of a 12-hour shift still echoing through her bones. Her name was Claire, though most people at St. Mary's Hospital called her Nightingale because she was always the one humming quietly through the night hours. Now at nearly 3 a.m, her voice was silent. Only the drone of the heater and the low hum of the radio filled the cabin of her little sedan as she pushed along the lonely Alaskan highway. The road was slick but empty, a winding ribbon through endless pines that leaned toward her car as though eavesdropping on her journey. The only light came from her headlights, slicing tunnels into the night. On the passenger seat sat a styrofoam cup of black coffee that had long gone cold, leaving only a faint, bitter aroma. She caught herself glancing at it anyway, almost out of habit, as if it offered reassurance. Claire was used to exhaustion, but tonight it sank differently, thicker, heavier. Her eyes strained against the snow-speckled dark, her shoulders tight under the bulky winter coat. The clock on the dash blinked 2:57 a.m. in faint green digits, each minute crawling slower than the last. Still, she comforted herself with small rituals, tapping the steering wheel in rhythm with the radio, whispering the words of a half-forgotten song, watching the vapor of her breath when she exhaled too close to the cold glass. Little anchors of normalcy kept her tethered. The forest loomed higher as the road narrowed. She imagined her husband already asleep back in their small house, the wood stove humming softly. She imagined their dog stretched across the couch, his paws twitching in dream. The thought made her smile faintly as she drove deeper into the dark, the tires humming steady beneath her. For a while it was almost peaceful. The world outside was white and black, branches heavy with snow. Every few miles a reflective road marker glared like a startled eye before vanishing again. The heater rattled faintly, pushing out air that smelled faintly of antifreeze. Claire shifted in her seat, rolling her sore neck. This was her world, familiar and predictable. A nurse coming home at the end of another shift, and yet something pressed against that sense of normalcy. At first it was the silence between songs on the radio, stretching too long as if the signal itself hesitated. Then it was the way the shadows of the trees seemed thicker than usual, their edges too sharp in her headlights. She shook her head, forcing a laugh at herself. The night played tricks, that was all. She had worked herself too long into weariness. She took a sip of the bitter coffee. The taste made her wince. That was when she noticed it. Not at first. Just a flicker, an impression, something in the mirror. She adjusted it absently, eyes flicking, back to the road. And then she froze. There was a man in her back seat. Her foot faltered on the gas. She blinked hard, the image searing itself into her mind, the outline of a figure sitting perfectly still, his head slightly bent as though watching his hands in his lap. She couldn't see his face clearly, but the shape was unmistakable. A man, broad-shouldered, silent. Her heart leapt into her throat. She twisted the wheel slightly, the car swaying. The figure didn't move, just sat there. Her first thought, had she picked someone up? Was her exhaustion so deep she didn't remember? No, impossible. She had left the hospital alone. She knew she had. She flicked her eyes back again. Still there. Her pulse hammered. Every nerve screamed to slam the brakes, to scream, to do anything, but she forced herself to breathe, to keep the wheel steady. The wipers thumped back and forth, each sweep a slow drumbeat in her ears. Finally, with a trembling hand, she jerked the car onto the shoulder, snow crunching under tires. She threw it into park and twisted around. The back seat was empty. Her breath came out in ragged clouds. She turned back to the mirror, then again to the seat. Empty. But the upholstery was indented faintly. The fabric creased in the shape of someone having sat there. And when she reached back with trembling fingers, the seat was warm. Claire recoiled as if burned, her hand snapping back. The heater hummed. Snow hissed softly against the windshield. The car was empty, completely empty. She sat there for a long moment, knuckles white around the steering wheel. Her heart pounded so loudly she thought it might echo. She told herself she was exhausted, hallucinating. Long shifts did that. She hadn't eaten properly. Her brain was tricking her, but the warmth on the seat lingered. She forced herself back onto the road, jaw clenched. The radio fizzed to static, before a song bled back in, warped and thin. Claire tried to lose herself in it, focusing on the words, on the safety of rhythm. Yet her eyes betrayed her, flicking to the mirror again and again, and then she saw him once more. The man was back, seated in silence, only this time his head was tilted upward, and his eyes, dark, impossible eyes, met hers in the glass. She choked back a scream and slammed the brakes. The tires shrieked against ice. The car fishtailed, then steadied. By the time it stopped, her hands were shaking uncontrollably. She twisted around, Empty, but the smell in the car had changed. Something damp, metallic, like old iron and wet clothes. She pulled back onto the highway, but now every shadow in the corner of her vision seemed to stretch toward her. The heater rattled violently, then cut out altogether, leaving her in a chill silence. Snow blurred across the windshield. The wipers scraped dry glass with each pass. Claire's breathing quickened. The forest seemed to close in tighter, pressing against her little cocoon of steel and glass. A whisper drifted from the back seat. Soft, indistinct, like someone speaking underwater. She froze. The mirror showed nothing. The seat looked bare. But the whisper persisted, threading through the silence, curling around her ears. Words she couldn't decipher. Her chest tightened. She wanted to stop, to fling open the door and run into the night. But the forest outside looked darker than death itself. No lights, no houses, no safety, only trees, only snow. Her mind spun, searching for explanation. A patient from the psych ward? No. She had driven straight from the hospital lot. No detours, no passengers, and yet a handprint appeared on the fogged rear window. Claire gasped, her throat tight. The print spread slowly, fingers long and too thin, the palm pressed flat from the inside. She glanced back wildly. No one there. The glass cleared again. Empty. The whisper grew louder, fractured syllables rising and falling, words that weren't words. The smell of iron thickened. Claire sobbed once, a broken sound gripping the wheel until her nails cut into her palms. "Stop," she whispered. "Please, stop." The headlights flickered, dimmed, then brightened again, and in that heartbeat of darkness, she glimpsed him, closer now. Not seated, but leaning forward, his face almost brushing hers in the mirror. His features were wrong, too sharp, too hollow, eyes like pits, a mouth that stretched wider than human. She screamed, slamming the accelerator. The car lunged forward, tires spitting slush. The forest blurred into streaks of black and white as she tore down the highway, heart battering her ribs. But the mirror betrayed her. The figure leaned closer with every mile, filling the reflection, his breath cold against her ear. Though no one sat there, the whisper became a rasp, a guttural chant. Her vision tunneled. The road pitched beneath her. She swerved, corrected, the wheel jerking in her grip. Snow sprayed from her tires. She thought of her husband, of the quiet wood stove, of safety, and knew she might never reach it. Then, silence. The mirror was empty. The smell faded. The whispers died. Claire slowed, chest heaving. Tears blurred her vision. She let out a shaking laugh, half hysteria, half relief. She had imagined it. Had to have. Her shoulders sagged as she eased the car back to a steady crawl. She whispered to herself over and over, "It's nothing. It's nothing." But when she reached back again, fingers brushing the seat, the warmth was still there, and this time it pulsed like the rhythm of a heartbeat. The wind was sharp, slicing across the cab of Carter Blake's old pickup as he maneuvered along the winding Alaskan back road. Snowflakes drifted lazily from the gray sky, clinging to the rust-speckled hood and melting into dark rivulets across the windshield. Carter's breath fogged the glass as he sipped from a travel mug of lukewarm coffee, the steam curling upward and mingling with the chill that seeped through the cracked window. The radio played an old blues tune, the crackle of static weaving through the melancholy guitar riffs, grounding him in the familiar rhythm of the road. His dog, Rusty, nestled on the passenger seat, shaking off a snowflake that had landed on his fur, the faint jingling of his collar the only other sound. It had been a long week of fishing along the icy rivers, hauling in salmon that seemed to grow thinner every year, and Carter welcomed the solitude that the road offered. The map on the dashboard was dog-eared, with routes marked and scrawled in faded ink, but even in this vast wilderness, he liked to know where he was. The sun was low, nearly invisible behind the thick clouds, casting everything in muted blues. and grays. The forest pressed in on either side, skeletal branches coated in frost groaning in the wind. There was a comforting emptiness here, a quiet that only these northern roads could offer. Yet something seemed off. Hours into the drive, a clearing appeared unexpectedly. A bridge stretched across a narrow river, wooden planks darkened and slick with ice. Carter frowned. He checked the map again, rubbing at the condensation on the glass. This bridge wasn't on any map he owned, nor had he ever driven this way before. Still, the road ended abruptly at its edge, the river stretching black and fast beneath it. With a shrug, he shifted into first gear. Rusty's ears perked as the truck groaned onto the planks. The wood creaked under the tires, the sound echoing into the frozen landscape like a warning. Carter's stomach twisted, but he focused on the rhythm of the wheels and the music on the radio. Just a bridge. That's all. The truck rolled slowly, each plank shivering under the weight, the gaps between them exposing the icy river below. Carter's eyes flicked down to the water, and a chill sharper than the wind ran through him. Figures, dark, human-shaped, motionless, stood knee-deep in the icy current, their features obscured by the fog that rose off the river. He blinked. Rusty growled low in his throat. Carter shook his head. The river should have been empty, frozen over, but the water swirled, black beneath those boards. The figures didn't move, didn't speak, didn't even seem to breathe. Heart pounding, he forced himself to look ahead and pressed the accelerator just enough to clear the other side. Once across, the bridge creaked behind him, the sound fading. As he drove on, the road curling into a grove of spruce trees, Carter tried to rationalize what he had seen. Ice and shadows, maybe, or a trick of the setting sun refracted in the water. He poured himself another gulp of coffee, feeling the bitter warmth fill his chest. Rusty was quiet now, ears pinned back, eyes alert. Carter chuckled nervously. "Just your imagination, boy," he muttered. But the shiver that ran along his spine refused to dissipate. The road flattened, snow turning to slush as night approached. Carter's headlights cut swaths through the thickening dusk, illuminating the skeletal trees that stood sentinel over the winding path. Silence stretched and stretched, the kind that presses in and fills your chest with cold. The occasional owl's hoot or the scrape of a branch against the truck was almost welcome. It confirmed the world was still tangible, still real. Yet something in the peripheral darkness seemed different somehow, like the shadows were watching, waiting. Carter kept glancing into the side mirrors, catching flickers of movement that vanished the moment he focused. He blamed the snow. He blamed the wind. But a creeping sense of dread grew in the pit of his stomach. Hours later, the road curved sharply along a frozen bend, and Carter's headlights reflected off an icy patch that hadn't been there before. Rusty stiffened, low growl rumbling from his chest. Then a distant squeal like metal dragged across ice echoed from the trees. Carter squinted through the falling snow. Nothing. Just the whispering of branches and the occasional gust of wind. He tapped the horn lightly, trying to shake the unease. The sound bounced off the snow, eerily hollow. Still nothing. He shook his head again, forcing himself to laugh. "Cold makes you see things," he said aloud. Rusty didn't look convinced. Minutes later, he arrived back at the mysterious bridge. His stomach sank. There it was, stretching across the river, like a phantom. The boards glistened with frost, dark and slick. Carter slowed, gripping the steering wheel tighter, peering into the water below. And again the shapes were there, figures standing knee-deep, unmoving, watching him. He blinked. Rusty barked once, short and sharp. Carter felt his throat tighten. No rational explanation fit. He shook his head, inching forward. The wood groaned in protest, echoing into the frozen wilderness. A shadow flickered in the mirror. Something moved behind him. Indistinct, human, yet wrong. Halfway across, the truck jolted as if hitting an unseen obstacle. The figures below shifted slightly, rising just above the waterline. Carter's hands shook. The radio crackled violently. the static swelling into unintelligible whispers. His chest pounded as he tried to focus on the road ahead, on the sound of tires against wood. The air seemed thicker, colder, pressing into the cab, muffling the music, filling his ears with an unnatural roar. Shadows seemed to curl around the bridge, stretching and writhing. Rusty whimpered, leaning against the door. Carter's heart raced, sweat freezing on his skin despite the cold. Then came the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, along the planks behind him. Heavy, echoing, but impossible. He was alone. He didn't dare look, pressing his gaze forward. The truck shuddered again as if resisting the bridge itself. The figures below now stood fully upright, water dripping from limbs unnaturally long, their eyes glinting faintly in the truck's headlights. Carter's breath came in gasps, fog curling around his face. He forced himself to keep moving, to not let the terror paralyze him. Every plank screamed beneath the tires, every shadow in the peripheral vision was alive. The footsteps grew louder, faster, synchronized with his own racing heartbeat. A sudden screech of metal echoed as a plank snapped under the truck, jolting it violently. Carter slammed the brakes, skidding, tires squealing against frost. Rusty barked frantically, claws scraping the seat. The figures below raised arms, and the wind carried a whisper, indistinct, but unmistakably human. Carter's pulse pounded in his ears. With a violent lurch, the truck cleared the final span. He skidded onto solid road, fishtailing, finally regaining control. Heart hammering, he didn't look back. The forest seemed quieter now, the snow falling in serene silence, almost mocking. Carter's hands were white on the wheel, knuckles tight, coffee long forgotten. Rusty sat silently, staring out the side window, ears twitching. Carter didn't speak for miles, gripping the wheel, eyes darting to the map he had carefully marked with routes and rivers. No bridge was noted anywhere, none at all. And yet, he knew what he had seen, what he had heard, what had tried to follow him across. When he returned the next day, daylight revealing every detail in harsh clarity, he drove back to the river. The bridge was gone. The water was frozen solid, smooth as glass, stretching under the pale winter sun. Carter slowed, disbelief clawing at his chest. Every footprint in the snow around the banks was his alone. No broken planks, no evidence of figures, just a frozen river, serene and innocent, lying in wait. He checked the map again. Still nothing. No road should have led here. No bridge should have existed at all. Yet Carter couldn't shake the memory. The groan of the wood beneath his tires, the figures in the water, the footsteps echoing behind him. He felt them in the corner of his vision, even now, in the safety of his cabin and the warmth of his bed. Rusty, unusually quiet, still occasionally, shivered, ears flattening, staring at corners where nothing stood. Carter told himself it had been a trick of exhaustion, snow, and isolation. But each night, when he closed his eyes, he heard the faint groan of wooden boards and the whisper of water beneath, a low, persistent call that promised the bridge might not be done with him yet. And somewhere deep in the forest, beneath the frozen river, he was certain the figures waited, watching, patiently, waiting for him to return. The question lingered in his mind long after he forced himself to sleep. Had the bridge truly existed, or had it been waiting, just for him, to step across into a world where the rules no longer applied? Carter did not know, and he feared he never would. The wind howled through the vast emptiness of Alaska's Richardson Highway, whipping up snow and ghostly drifts that swallowed the edges of the road. Michael Carter gripped the steering wheel with knuckles pale under calloused skin, the heater, struggling against the chill that seeped through the cracked window seals of his aging Ford F-150. He had been driving for nearly 10 hours straight, hauling refrigerated cargo from Fairbanks to Anchorage, a stretch of highway that could lull even the most vigilant driver into a hypnotic trance. The dashboard clock glowed an unfeeling orange, and the radio carried the faint hum of static with an occasional tinny country tune, barely audible above the roar of the wind. A half-empty thermos of coffee rested in the cup holder, steam still, curling into the air with a bitter aroma that promised warmth but delivered little. Snowflakes clung to the windshield, dancing in the glare of his high beams, which reflected off the white horizon to create a disorienting, shimmering blur. Michael sipped his coffee and exhaled, watching his breath fog the inside of the cab, a fleeting cloud that dissolved almost immediately. His mind wandered to the small comforts of home, the creaking floorboards of his apartment, his cat nudging at his legs for attention, the sound of the heater ticking in sync with his pulse. Out here, though, in this expanse of white and silence, the world seemed muted, stripped down to the essentials. The road, the truck, and the wind gnawing at the edges of the world. It was a lonely stretch, a place where a man could feel both weightless and unnervingly exposed, the forest on either side looming like silent sentinels. As he drove, Michael's eyes scanned the road for any sign of life. There were occasional markers, faded reflectors, a lone mailbox dusted with snow, but no other vehicles, no footprints, no movement of any kind. His radio crackled faintly, a distorted voice carrying through the static for a moment before fading back into silence. He frowned, adjusting the dial, but the song returned with a tinny, hollow loop. He felt a shiver creep down his spine and shook his head, blaming fatigue and the endless white horizon for his unease. Nothing out here could surprise him. He told himself that as he sipped the lukewarm coffee again, ignoring the gnawing suspicion that he was not as alone as he believed. The truck hummed steadily beneath him, tires crunching through a thin layer of fresh snow. For hours it had been a monotonous rhythm. The engines drone, the winds howl, and the occasional creak of metal as the cab flexed in the cold. Michael had memorized this stretch of highway by heart. He knew where the potholes were, where the road narrowed, and where the overpasses allowed snow to collect in treacherous sheets. It was predictable, familiar, and yet, tonight felt different. The air seemed heavier, the snow falling in a pattern too deliberate, as if each flake carried a message. He could feel it in the corners of his vision, the way shadows twisted, unnaturally beneath the tree line, elongated and then vanished when he blinked. The sensation was fleeting, easy to dismiss, and he did, laughing quietly at his own paranoia. A sudden burst of movement shattered the fragile comfort. Headlights, blinding and enormous, tore through the blizzard, appearing from nowhere. Michael slammed the brakes instinctively, heart hammering, and the truck skidded on the ice-coated asphalt. For a few terrifying seconds, he was certain he would be crushed by a semi barreling down the highway, a monstrous silhouette with wheels that seemed to devour the snow as it hurtled toward him. He twisted the wheel, jerking the truck onto the shoulder, snow spraying in all directions, and finally came to a halt. The cab was silent now, save for his ragged breathing and the whistle of the wind through the cracked door seals. The headlights he had glimpsed were gone, swallowed by the blizzard as if they had never existed. He blinked, staring at the snow that whipped past his windshield, trying to reconcile what had just happened. There were no tire tracks on the road, nothing to suggest another vehicle had passed. No rumble of an engine, no whoosh of air displaced by a passing truck. Only the emptiness of the snowy night pressing in around him. Michael's pulse thundered in his ears as he tried to calm himself, repeating the rational explanations. Maybe it was a hallucination caused by exhaustion. Maybe a reflection off the ice had created the illusion of lights. He muttered under his breath, shaking his head, telling himself he would drive a little further, find the next rest stop, and breathe. His hands trembled slightly as he restarted the engine, the roar of the truck filling the void left by the phantom semi. He gripped the wheel tighter, eyes darting to the mirrors, each glance feeling like a risk, as if something might materialize from the shadowy tree line. The snow fell heavier now, drifts forming at the edges of the road, and the wind's cry became a chorus of low, eerie moans. Every turn of the wheel seemed amplified, every bump on the road a potential hazard. Michael's mind sharpened to the smallest of details. The crunch of tires in the snow, the faint echo of branches snapping somewhere in the distance, the way the headlights reflected off the ice in strange, unnatural patterns. He felt it, a presence not physical but something watching, waiting in the periphery. Shadows lengthened and shifted with the flickering beams of his truck, and for a brief moment, he thought he saw a figure crouched at the edge of the road, only to vanish when he focused. Hours passed, or perhaps only minutes. It was impossible to tell. Time itself seemed swallowed by the blizzard, condensed into a relentless frozen present. Every mile felt like a loop, the road curling back on itself, the trees forming the same patterns over and over. Then, without warning, the lights appeared again. A semi roaring, its headlights piercing through the storm, appearing as though conjured from the snow itself. Michael slammed on the brakes once more, skidding violently, the truck fishtailing as the monstrous vehicle bore down on him. He swerved to the shoulder, snow spraying in high arcs, his heart in his throat. But when he looked, there was no road disturbance, no signs of tires having pressed the snow into the asphalt. The semi had vanished. Panic surged, the rational mind fracturing under the weight of fear. Michael pulled off the road completely, burying the truck in a shallow drift, and cut the engine. The cab was still, the blizzard seemingly holding its breath. The silence was immense, oppressive, and in it, Michael felt the weight of the unseen. He stepped outside, boots sinking into the snow, the cold biting through his coat. He scanned the horizon. Nothing. The road stretched empty, the trees still, the wind stilled as if the world had forgotten how to move. Yet he could feel it, and awareness, a gaze that followed him in the periphery, never quite forming, never fully showing itself. The truck behind him, the phantom semi, was gone. There were no tracks, no sound, only the relentless snow and the low, hollow ache in the chest that came from knowing something was out there. Michael retreated to the cab, locking the doors and pressing his forehead against the cold glass, watching. Minutes or hours passed, he could not tell. The radio remained dead, the lights dim. And then, in the distance, a pair of headlights blinked on far down the highway. He squinted, heart hammering, but the lights did not move closer. They remained a static point in the storm, two beacons that seemed to stare back at him. The engine coughed and sputtered as he restarted the truck. Every muscle tensed as he drove cautiously, eyes fixed on the empty road, every shadow, every flicker of light demanding his attention. He did not know what he had encountered. If it was a hallucination, some trick of the snow and isolation, or something far older, far darker, stalking the lonely roads of Richardson Highway. By the time Michael reached the next gas station, hours later, the sun had begun to struggle through the clouds, turning the storm into a gray, slushy wash. Parked hands shaking and went inside, the warmth of fluorescent lights and the faint smell of coffee a relief almost too mundane to be real. He recounted the event to the attendant, who nodded politely, offering no reassurance, only the routine greeting of someone used to drivers spooked by long nights in the Alaskan wilderness. Michael drove away eventually, returning home to Fairbanks, the memory of the phantom semi lingering like an echo in the mind. He tried to tell himself it was over, that the storm and isolation had played tricks on him. Yet every time he closed his eyes, he could see the lights, hear the roar, feel the oppressive weight of silence pressing from all sides. He knew deep down that somewhere along that endless highway, the semi might still be waiting, silent, unseen and patient. And when night fell, he found himself wondering if the next driver would see it too, or if it would vanish again, leaving only the ghostly imprint of fear on the snow. Because on Richardson Highway, some things are not meant to be understood. Some things are only meant to be felt, lurking in the white vastness, patient, watching, waiting for the moment when the road is empty, the wind is still, and the silence presses too heavily to ignore. And Michael Carter would never forget the way the headlights had appeared, blinding, roaring, and then simply gone, leaving nothing but a question that had no answer and a fear that had no relief. The wind had begun its relentless howl hours before, rattling the metal of the pickup's roof and sending jagged snowflakes dancing like restless spirits across the highway. Simon's fingers ached inside his gloves as he gripped the steering wheel, headlights cutting feeble cones through the blizzard. He had been driving for almost 6 hours, delivering supplies to a remote research outpost that rarely received visitors, a route that had long since earned the reputation of being perilous in winter. The radio buzzed with static, the occasional news clip breaking through, but mostly it was white noise, a kind of monotonous comfort. Steam curled from the travel mug of lukewarm coffee between his legs, and the scent of pine from the air freshener barely masked the faint odor of wet wool from his coat. For a man like Simon, accustomed to solitude on the road, there was a rhythm to these drives. The hum of tires on ice, the crunch of snow over unseen patches of frozen gravel, the eerie quiet punctuated by sudden gusts of wind. Tonight, however, the snow was thick enough to flatten even the familiar landmarks. The GPS reassured him with its soft female voice, though even her words felt distant as if muffled by the storm. He hummed along with a faint tune on the radio, his eyes tracing the dim glow of road markers barely visible through the swirling white. Somewhere in the distance, a skeletal tree shook, sending a spray of snow down like a tiny avalanche. Hours passed with the kind of monotony that dulls even the sharpest senses. Simon's mind wandered to home, his small apartment cluttered with maps and mugs he never drank from, the old dog sleeping by the radiator, the faint scent of baked bread he would miss tonight. He glanced at the dashboard clock. It was nearing midnight. Then, through the haze of snow and shadows, a warm, flickering light appeared. Small, orange, inviting. A cabin. A small structure at the forest's edge, smoke curling lazily from a chimney. Simon's stomach clenched with relief. The storm had been growing, visibility dropping to mere feet, and the thought of a roof, a fire, maybe even company, was irresistible. He slowed the truck onto the snowy shoulder, leaving a track that immediately began to vanish under the fresh fall. The lantern glow swung faintly through the window, a silent beckon. Simon grabbed his coat, the edges frosted with ice, and stepped out, the cold biting through layers. Snow crunched beneath his boots as he approached the cabin, hands brushing against the frost-laden railing. He knocked on the door, fist raised, knuckles sending vibrations through the thick wooden frame. No answer. He tried again, louder this time, voice carrying only the wind's echo. Nothing. Curiosity edged his apprehension. The door was slightly ajar and he nudged it gently. Inside, warmth hit him like a wall. The fire crackled merrily in a stone hearth, sending long shadows across walls lined with wooden panels. The scent of burning wood mingled with something faintly sweet, perhaps a forgotten loaf of bread or melted candle wax. Chairs were neatly arranged, a table set as if expecting company. Yet as Simon's eyes swept across the room, the unease grew. The snow outside the cabin, as far as he could see through the frosted window, bore no other footprints. Only his own leading to the door, frozen and solitary. Something wasn't right. But the warmth and promise of refuge drew him further inside. He hung his coat, shook snow from his boots, and moved closer to the fire, letting the glow wash over his face. A mug sat on the table, half filled with something, steaming, though no one seemed to have been here to make it. His instincts urged caution, yet he settled into a chair, convincing himself he was imagining things. The storm outside intensified, wind gnawing at the corners of the cabin, but inside, there was an uncanny stillness. Shadows from the fire danced across the walls, elongated and flickering, forming shapes just at the edge of vision. Simon shook. His head laughed quietly at himself, muttering, "I'm losing it out here." But even as he spoke, the soft whisper of the wind seemed to carry a voice back, almost like a reply, almost human. He froze. At first, it was subtle. A creak in the floorboards behind him. Then a muffled scuff like someone or something was pacing just beyond the doorway. Simon rose, holding the mug like a fragile shield, peering into the dim corners of the cabin. Nothing. The sense of being observed grew heavier, each shadow stretching, twisting into shapes that didn't belong. He told himself it was just the storm playing tricks, the firelight casting illusions. He exhaled slowly, trying to center his racing heart. And yet, a fleeting movement by the window caught his eye. A figure? No, just a trick of the flames. Still, his nerves were taut, as if he were balancing on the edge of something unseen. Minutes later, a low knock echoed, soft but deliberate, coming from the far side of the cabin. Simon froze, eyes scanning every wall, every shadow. The door he had entered through remained closed, solid. The knocking repeated, then a whisper followed, unintelligible, yet intimate. His name. The hairs on his neck prickled. He stumbled toward the door, hand trembling to leave, but the latch seemed to tighten under his grip as if resisting. Then, the lantern in the window flickered violently, and the wind outside roared like an angry beast. He stepped back, heart hammering, and the room's warmth seemed to invert, curling cold fingers around him. Footsteps appeared in the snow outside, though he had seen no one. Heavy, deliberate, circling the cabin. Simon's gaze darted to the window, eyes straining against the storm. A shadow passed just beyond the glass, fleeting, human-shaped yet unnervingly wrong. He stumbled to the door, fumbling with the handle, and when it finally gave way, he flung it open. The snow had been flattened in a circle around the cabin, like something or someone had been pacing, watching. The storm obscured any detail, but the tracks were not his own, deep and crisp, yet vanishing unnaturally in patches. He backed into the cabin, spinning around. The fire sputtered, flames bending as if drawn toward the corners of the room. Simon's mind raced, every rational explanation drowned in instinctual terror. The fire flickered, elongating shadows that now seemed to writhe, closing in. A cold gust swept through the cabin, extinguishing the lantern on the table. Darkness pressed against him, suffocating, and a soft, wet whisper, almost a hiss, slid across the walls. His breath came in staccato bursts, fogging in the frigid air, now creeping inside. Something emerged from the corner opposite the hearth. A shape, faint but solid, moving against the firelight. It paused, indistinct, features blurred yet undeniably watching him. His body froze, muscles locked. The shape flickered like an apparition, vanishing only to appear closer, nearer, behind the table, as if the cabin itself were bending space to trap him. He bolted toward the door, flinging it open into the storm. Snow met his face with sharp cold, but he ran, teeth chattering, boots sinking into deep drifts. The tracks around the cabin now appeared freshly filled in by the wind, leaving no trace of the circling, looming presence. Behind him, he thought he heard a laugh, soft, intimate, impossible to locate in the howling storm. Every instinct screamed to keep moving, but the road ahead had disappeared under the blizzard, a wall of white that mocked his desperation. Simon tripped, snow swallowing his scream, and scrambled upright. The firelight from the cabin seemed to flicker through the storm like a pulse, a heartbeat. Hours blurred. The wind chewed at his face, the icy road concealing treacherous patches of hidden ice. Somewhere, faintly, the cabin's glow appeared in the periphery of his vision, always just out of reach, as if mocking him. Simon didn't stop. He ran until exhaustion made him stagger, vision narrowing until a dark shape loomed ahead. At first, he thought it was a tree. Then he realized it moved in rhythm with his panic, following. He could not discern its form, half shadow, half flesh, but its presence was undeniable, pressing into his peripheral vision just beyond comprehension. Eventually, he collapsed beside a snowbank, lungs burning, chest heaving, eyes scanning the white wasteland. The storm waned slightly, leaving a chilling calm. Simon could no longer see the cabin. Had he imagined it? Or had it been real, and whatever was there still lingered? He felt the cold seep through his clothing, shivering violently, yet could not shake the feeling of being watched. Somewhere deep in the frozen forest, a faint light glimmered, a soft, beckoning pulse. Not a lantern, not a flame. Something else. Something waiting. Simon lay there, caught between relief and terror, the snow around him pristine again as if nothing had ever happened. Only the crunch of his own heartbeat filled the silence. He had survived the night, yet the memory of the cabin, of the shadows, of the footsteps circling would remain. Perhaps it was a dream, a trick of the storm, or perhaps something else, a presence that waited just beyond sight, patient, unseen. He rose slowly, shaking snow from his coat, glancing back toward where the cabin should have been. There was nothing but the forest, whispering secrets, waiting, and in the distance he swore he saw the faintest flicker of a light, a pulse, as if calling him back. The question lingered, sharper than the cold wind. Had he really escaped? Or was the cabin and what dwelled within simply waiting for the next traveler, patient and eternal in the snow? The pale gray light of dawn had barely begun to stretch across the northern horizon when Jake and Mason slid into the cab of Mason's battered pickup. The frost on the windshield scraped under the edge of their gloved hands, tiny shards of ice breaking into the faded wiper streaks. Coffee steamed from the thermos wedged in the cup holder, the bitter scent filling the cramped cab, mingling with the faint pine scent still clinging to their jackets from yesterday's hunt. Mason flipped. The ignition and the engine grumbled awake, echoing faintly across the empty snow-blanketed road. The mountains loomed on either side, their jagged edges dark against the breaking light. And for a moment everything seemed ordinary, like it always did before they ventured too far into the wilderness. The truck's headlights cut narrow beams through the dense patches of fog that clung stubbornly to the road. Jake leaned back, the radio crackling softly, static and snippets of old music filling the pauses in conversation. "First hunt of the season," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. Mason grunted in agreement, his hands tight around the wheel. They both knew these roads like the lines on their palms, yet there was a thrill in the unfamiliar frost, the way each curve and ridge seemed to promise something unknown just beyond sight. Somewhere far ahead, the forest swallowed the road, dense and silent, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. The first hour passed in near silence, broken only by the occasional chirp from the radio. Static shimmered over the old hunting channel, a mix of white noise and distant signals bouncing across the snowy peaks. Mason hummed a half-remembered tune, the warmth of the cab and the routine of the drive lulling him into comfort. Jake kept, glancing at the dashboard, the needle steady, the fuel gauge holding, the thermometer hovering just below freezing. Everything was normal, almost too normal. And yet, as the miles stretched on, a strange tension began threading through the air. It was subtle at first, the way the trees seemed a little too still, the way the mist held onto the edges of the headlights as if hesitant to let them pass. A shift in the wind, a tiny crunch from the snow that wasn't their own, barely perceptible beneath the engine's hum. They laughed it off, calling it the wilderness playing tricks on the mind, a trick of exhaustion and early mornings. By the second hour, the radio sputtered, the music fading into static that crackled louder than it should. Mason twisted the dial, scanning through the channels, but nothing came through, only the hiss of white noise. "Weird," he muttered, tapping the receiver. Jake shrugged. "Probably just a dead spot. Happens all the time up here." But then cutting through the static came a whisper. Faint, almost drowned in the hiss, it spoke Jake's name. He froze. "Jake. Left turn coming. Slow down." The words were soft, almost intimate, like someone standing just outside, the cab leaning close to the glass. Mason froze too, his hand tightening on the wheel. "Did you hear that?" Jake asked, voice low. Only static answered for a moment, but then Mason's name slipped through, almost in a hiss. "Mason, watch the shoulder. Don't swerve." Both men exchanged a tense glance, the early morning light seeming colder, sharper, heavier on their shoulders. Mason laughed nervously. "It's a prank, or maybe it's a glitch. Radio's old." But the pit in their stomachs told them it was more than that. Minutes later, the whispering returned, clearer, more insistent. Names, routes, small personal details. Things only they would know. "Take the next left. Not the cabin. Slower." Each suggestion precise, almost omniscient. The radio static flared and dimmed, the volume flickering on its own. The forest outside became a blur of whites and dark shapes, the trees slamming past like shadows of something alive. Jake's grip tightened around the passenger seat, his knuckles whitening. It's reading us," he whispered. Mason turned, eyes scanning the rearview mirror. half expecting to see a shadow clinging to the tailgate. There was nothing. Nothing but empty road, snow curling off the dear edges of the tires and the intermittent glint of frost in the pale light. And then, as suddenly as it began, the voice ceased. The static returned to its normal, indifferent hiss. The radio log, however, showed no incoming signal, no anomaly, nothing ever transmitted. Yet neither man doubted what they had just heard. The silence afterward was suffocating. Their breaths misted in the cab, every exhale sounding unnaturally loud. Mason restarted the truck radio, tapping frantically at the dials, listening to static, waiting for any echo of the voice. The forest around them remained mute, and even the snow seemed to pause its descent from the gray sky. Jake leaned back, straining to recall details of the voice, the timbre, the cadence, the almost playful familiarity. But it resisted memory, like mist slipping through fingers. Despite Mason's reassurances, a chill gnawed at them, sharper than the wind whipping, across the ridge outside. Something about the forest, the road, the radio, it had shifted. Small sounds began to feel deliberate. The hollow creak of a branch, the thump of snow from the trees, the faint scraping echoing somewhere just beyond the headlights. Their senses sharpened. Every movement seemed amplified, every shadow an accusation. By mid-morning, the subtle disturbances escalated. The whisper returned intermittently, sometimes instructive, sometimes a laugh too soft to place. The trees bent unnaturally in the wind, or maybe it was the cab, rocking slightly on an invisible pulse. Radio channels switched themselves, transmitting nothing but brief, flickering bursts of their names. Each turn in the road felt predestined, as if the whisper knew exactly where they would go. Mason's eyes darted to the rearview mirror repeatedly, imagining or fearing the presence of a passenger he couldn't see. Jake's hands trembled on the thermos, coffee sloshing over the edges, scalding his palms. Yet the pain registered, only faintly beneath his rising dread. Every sense screamed a warning they couldn't ignore. They were no longer just traveling through the forest. They were moving through something aware, something alive in its observation. And then the laughter began, a thin, curling sound threading through the static, teasing, intimate, personal, and impossibly near. Their terror crescendoed in the deepening afternoon. A shadow darted across the road ahead, but when they approached, the asphalt remained empty, frozen, untouched. The radio, previously inert, erupted into a chorus of whispers, simultaneously speaking each of their names, reciting places only they had been, recalling secrets they had thought forgotten. The truck's lights flickered as if breathing, dimming, and pulsing in rhythm with their escalating heartbeat. Snow whipped sideways, sticking to the glass like frozen fingers. Mason's tires skidded slightly on an unseen patch, the crunching sound deafening. Then, from the rear view, a figure appeared, tall, thin, pale as frost, standing at the edge of the road. It tilted its head, watching, listening, somehow smiling, though its features were impossible to read. Jake slammed his hand on the horn, startling them both. The figure vanished, leaving only an eerie emptiness, the whisper's echo lingering, now urgent. Faster. Don't stop. Don't look back. The forest seemed to close in, swallowing the light, absorbing the sound of the engine. Every mile became a labyrinth of dread, the trees pressing in, their gnarled shadows forming impossible shapes on the windshield. Mason's voice shook as he muttered instructions Jake could barely hear. Left. Right. No. Wait. Did I? Radio interjected, anticipating them, correcting them, guiding them with cruel precision. The air turned icy, each breath a sharp, searing stab. Suddenly, from the cab's mirrors, multiple figures emerged, silent passengers leaning in, mouths just beyond the whisper of comprehension, their presence suffocating. Tires screeched over the snow, sending spray into the night air. Their hearts hammered, muscles taut, senses screaming for escape. And then, as quickly as it all exploded, the forest opened into a clearing. The figures vanished, the whispers stopped, and silence fell heavy again, thick and unbroken. Yet in the back of their minds, the echo persisted. The radio displayed nothing, Absolutely nothing. Hours later, they found themselves parked at the edge of a small, abandoned gas station. The sun had dipped behind thick clouds, leaving a cold, washed-out light that barely touched the snow. Coffee long cold, hands trembling, they examined the radio again. Logs showed no reception, no incoming frequencies, nothing transmitted at all. Mason traced the edge of the dashboard as if touching might conjure an answer. "Did that happen?" he whispered. Jake shook his head slowly, staring down the empty road, frozen tracks from the truck stretching behind them, fading into the white. There was no one, no signal, nothing to explain what they had just survived. Yet the memory of the voice of the forest bending and breathing, of names whispered with intimate knowledge, clung to them like frostbite. They left the truck running, doors open to the cold, reluctant to turn away from the road, unwilling to dismiss what they had felt. Even now, weeks later, neither has spoken of it in detail. Friends and family ask about the trip. They offer vague smiles, changing the subject quickly. But late at night, when the wind taps against the windows, when the silence stretches and a strange static hums through old radios, they remember. Jake sometimes swears he hears his name carried in the draft, faint and teasing. Mason, checking the rearview mirror on familiar roads, glimpses shapes in the periphery he knows aren't there. The radio remains in Mason's truck, untouched, yet perfectly intact, a silent relic of a morning that never truly ended. And every time they drive the empty stretches of forest road, there is a quiet question that hangs like frozen breath in the air. If the radio could speak back once, why stop? And what, or who, was still listening, waiting, just beyond the static? Snow swirled across the Yukon highway, thin flakes drifting lazily in the bitter wind that gnawed at the edges of Michael Hargrove's parka. He shifted on the leather seat of his aging pickup truck, one hand on the wheel, the other holding a lukewarm thermos of coffee. The dashboard clock glowed a pale green, 2:17 a.m. He'd been driving for hours, delivering supplies to a small logging outpost that relied on trucks like his to survive the long winter. His headlights cut through the darkness, reflecting off the freshly fallen snow, creating a tunnel of white that seemed to stretch endlessly into the frozen night. On the radio, a faint crackle carried snippets of a folk song, the melancholy violin straining against the static. Steam rose in gentle spirals from the coffee cup, filling the cab with a warmth that contrasted sharply with the chill seeping through the worn door seals. Michael exhaled, watching his breath curl in the dim interior light. The tires crunched rhythmically over the compacted snow, a steady cadence that had become hypnotic after countless nights like this. He liked these drives. They were quiet, predictable, and he could think about his daughter Emily at home. She'd left a note on the fridge. "Stay safe, Daddy. Don't forget your mittens." It had made him laugh, even in the loneliness of the road. That tiny slice of normalcy, the mundane routines of truck stops, the fleeting warmth of gas station coffee, the way the headlights caught the frost on the trees. It was comforting. Every pine and spruce leaned under the weight of snow, silent sentinels, watching over him as he drove. For now, nothing could touch him. The Yukon was as much a friend as it was a challenge, a frozen expanse he had learned to navigate with caution and respect. The rhythm of the tires, the soft hiss of the heater, the occasional howl of wind against the cab, these were the sounds of his world. Yet amidst this calm, the road felt longer tonight. Shadows stretched unnaturally in the peripheral glow of the headlights. Snowflakes, small and delicate at first, seemed to thicken with each mile, catching the light in a way that made the world shimmer and waver. A shiver ran down his spine, but he chalked it up to fatigue. Drivers always felt the isolation more on long stretches like this, when the lights of civilization were hours behind, and the trees leaned closer to the road than they had any right to. He sipped his coffee, savoring the warmth, and hummed along, to the scratchy tune on the radio, forcing himself to focus on the mundane. It was just past the halfway marker when Michael noticed her. A figure, small and wavering, standing by the edge of the road. He squinted through the frost-laced windshield. At first, he thought it was a trick of the headlights against a clump of snow-laden branches. But the shape moved, lifting an arm as if waving frantically. He slowed the truck, heart picking up its pace. His mind raced through possibilities. Stranded hiker, lost camper, maybe even someone from a local town that didn't have phone service for miles. The figure resolved into a woman, barefoot, dressed in a long white dress that clung to her form as though wet. Snow clung to her hair and the hems of her dress, but she didn't seem cold, or perhaps she was too still to show it. "Need a hand?" he called through the rolled-down window, but the words barely carried over the roar of the engine and the wind. The woman's head tilted slightly, and then, almost imperceptibly, she nodded. Michael's pulse quickened, a strange unease threading through him. He parked at a cautious distance, the truck's heater rattling in protest against the cold. Stepping out, the snow crunching beneath his boots, he approached slowly. The woman didn't move toward him. She just lifted her hand and placed it lightly on the hood of his truck. He flinched at the touch. It wasn't warm, nor was it merely cold. It burned, frost biting into his skin as if the warmth of his body were being siphoned away. When he looked down, the shape of her hand was burned into the metal, a stark white imprint that seemed impossible in its clarity. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, and when he looked back, she was gone. The stillness that followed was deafening. Michael's own breath seemed loud, a ragged exhale in the night. His heart pounded as he surveyed the road. No footprints, no disturbed snow, just the endless line of dark forest. A gust of wind rattled the branches overhead, and for a fleeting moment he swore he saw her silhouette between the trees watching him. Shaking, he climbed back into the cab, slamming the door against the cold. The radio sputtered, then hissed, distorting the folk song into a warped, almost wailing melody. Michael's hands gripped the wheel tighter as he forced himself to drive, telling himself it was exhaustion, imagination, the stress of a long night's work. Yet the imprint on the hood glowed faintly in the headlight reflection, a mark that would not fade with time. Minutes turned into an hour, and the forest pressed in from either side, dark and indifferent. The snow thickened, and with each passing mile, the headlights seemed to reveal fleeting shapes just beyond the tree line, branches that arched unnaturally, shadows that shouldn't have moved. The uneasy sensation of being watched settled in the pit of his stomach. Every crunch of tires on snow sounded louder, sharper, like the echo of some unseen footstep. His radio signal broke again, static flaring into sharp, high-pitched shrieks, before settling into silence. Michael tried to shake it off, tried to focus on the road, but the forest seemed to grow denser, the night stretching into something eternal. He glanced at the rearview mirror, expecting nothing, and saw a flicker of white, a reflection that moved in ways it shouldn't. The sensation of being followed, of being observed, intensified with each mile. Every shadow seemed to twitch at the edge of his vision. Every gust of wind carried whispers that vanished when he strained to hear. He tried to keep calm, telling himself that he was imagining things, that the stress and isolation were twisting perception. But then the lights appeared again faintly, just at the periphery of the road. Barefoot footprints pressed into the snow, appearing and disappearing as if the ground itself rejected their presence. Michael's heartbeat escalated, the truck feeling smaller, more vulnerable amid the vast, silent wilderness. Then he saw her again, in full clarity, stepping from the shadows onto the road. Her dress floated around her, wet and tattered at the hem, hair plastered to her face with frost. She raised her hand in a slow, deliberate wave, beckoning. Something about the way she moved was unnatural, as if she were gliding, unbound by the friction of snow or gravity. Michael froze, the engine running low and the heater rattling, unsure whether to step forward or retreat. He remembered the handprint, the frozen burn that lingered on the hood, and a cold dread gripped him. The forest seemed to lean closer, the trees whispering secrets only he could hear. The radio hissed violently, then cleared briefly, and a distorted voice seemed to call his name. He slammed the door, hit the accelerator, tires screeching against the icy road as he fled. In the mirror, he thought he saw another figure, mirrored precisely in the rear view, though the passenger seat was empty. The snow outside erupted in flurries that obscured vision, yet he felt her presence all around him. The truck's headlights caught the pale glare of eyes in the distance, reflecting a light that shouldn't exist in the dark. Branches scraped the sides of the truck as if unseen hands were testing the metal. Michael's own reflection in the windshield wavered, and for a moment the woman's face overlapped his own, a frozen, frost-bitten visage staring back. Panic clawed at him, the world narrowing to the tunnel of road, the white blur of snow, and the faint silhouette that seemed to flicker just ahead and behind simultaneously. A sudden gust of wind slammed against the cab, snow blasting through the cracked windows, and he slammed his foot on the brakes. The truck skidded, tires digging, into ice, and for a heartbeat the world tilted on its axis. When the vehicle steadied, the road was empty. The woman had vanished. Michael didn't stop until the faint glow of a distant gas station appeared, lights flickering weakly through the storm. He pulled into the lot, chest heaving, eyes scanning the perimeter, mind scrambling to make sense of what had happened. The heater rattled, steam rising from his thermos, mundane warmth returning like a lifeline. Yet when he looked at the hood, the frost-burned imprint glowed faintly under the overhead lights, impossibly clear, a reminder that something had touched him, and it had left its mark. Shaking, he parked, forced himself inside the station, and tried to rationalize, telling the clerk he must have seen things, let the exhaustion play tricks. He slept in the truck that night, reluctant to leave. Morning light revealed snow disturbed only by his own tires. No footprints, nothing to confirm the vision of the previous night. But when he returned home, parking in his garage, he froze. The hood of the truck, gleaming under the fluorescent light, bore the same frost-burned handprint he had seen on the Yukon road. No snow, no ice, just the stark, impossibly clear outline of a woman's hand. Michael traced it with a trembling finger, feeling the residual chill, the almost imperceptible burn. For weeks after, he kept the truck in the garage, hesitant to drive. Every night the radio hissed slightly when tuned to static, and fleeting. Shadows appeared in the corners of his eyes. He told himself it was stress, imagination. And yet, when he dreamed, he saw her, barefoot and white-clad, standing at the edge of the forest, hand outstretched, waiting for him. Sometimes he could swear he heard the crunch of snow on his driveway when no one was there. He never returned to that stretch of the Yukon road, not willingly. Yet occasionally, in the dead of night, the faint reflection of white dress flickers in his rearview mirror, or a whisper flares on the static, and he wonders if she is still out there, waiting, and if she had really left that handprint, or if she had followed him all the way home. The unanswered question lingers unbroken as he lies awake, imagining frost-burned fingers tracing metal, always tracing, always there. The cold was a living thing, creeping in from every angle, biting through the fabric of his jacket and numbing the tips of his fingers even through thick gloves. Tyler shifted in the driver's seat, gripping the wheel of his aging sedan as it hummed over the ice-slicked asphalt of the Alaska highway. The late afternoon sun had disappeared behind clouds that seemed permanently bruised, leaving the road an endless ribbon of gray and white. Steam rose from his thermos of coffee, curling and twisting in the frigid air inside the car, and he welcomed the warmth that seeped into his palms as he took a sip. His backpack, filled with textbooks, a change of clothes, and snacks for the long trip, leaned against the passenger seat untouched. The radio crooned soft classic rock, a song from college playlists, grounding him in normalcy even as the desolate landscape blurred past. Snow-laden trees flanked either side of the road, their skeletal branches clawing at the sky, and the headlights painted a yellow path into the endless dusk. Tyler had been driving for hours, the monotony broken only by the occasional flash of an elk or the distant wail of a lone coyote. His fingers drummed lightly against the steering wheel, keeping time with the song. He glanced at the rearview mirror, noting the empty road behind him, and then returned his gaze to the stretch of highway ahead. The air smelled faintly of pine and frozen earth, sharp and clean. He thought about how nice it would be to pull into a warm cabin, light a fire, and sleep until morning, But he had promised himself he would make it to Anchorage before nightfall. For now, the small bubble of his car, the heater's low hum, the warmth of his mug, the crackling music, felt safe, a temporary refuge from the relentless cold outside. Hours of driving had settled him into a rhythm, but something along the shoulder caught his eye. At first he thought it was a trick of the snow, a tree branch silhouetted against the gray horizon, but the figure stepped forward into the faint amber glow of his headlights. A man, mid-30s perhaps, trudging through the snow with a stooped gait, dressed in nothing more than a thin shirt and jeans. Tyler blinked, startled. The temperature was well below zero. The man's attire should have frozen him solid. He slowed the car instinctively, instinctive concern fighting the gnawing unease curling in his stomach. The man lifted a hand and pointed at the road behind Tyler, then nodded toward the passenger door, as if asking for a ride. Tyler hesitated, instinct screaming at him to keep driving, but there was something almost pleading in the man's expression, or what he could see of it beneath the frozen frost coating his cheeks. He unlocked the door. The man slid in silently, the faint smell of damp earth and frost clinging to his clothes. He didn't speak, didn't shift, didn't move as Tyler merged back onto the highway, keeping the speed slow, careful not to lose control on the slick surface. At first, Tyler tried to make conversation, asking where he was headed, commenting on the weather, on the desolate beauty of the landscape. The man's lips moved faintly, a whisper perhaps, or maybe the words were swallowed by the roar of the engine because Tyler couldn't hear a thing. His attempts at small talk faded into uneasy silence, and he found himself stealing glances at his passenger. The man's eyes were dark, empty, like shadowed pits, and his expression never changed. Occasionally his gaze met Tyler's, just for a moment before flicking away toward the windshield, toward nothing at all. Tyler shook off the chill crawling up his spine, blaming the long drive, the isolation, the bitter cold, anything to keep the logical part of his mind in control. Snow fell heavier now, tiny flakes smearing across the windshield, forcing Tyler to squint. The highway had narrowed, trees pressing closer to the road, branches groaning under the weight of frost. Every so often, the tires crunched against hidden ice patches, a harsh reminder that control could be lost in a heartbeat. Yet no matter how many times he glanced at the passenger seat, the man remained perfectly still. Seatbelt buckled, hands folded in his lap. The silence became oppressive, a weight pressing down, making each passing minute longer than the last. Tyler's pulse quickened when he thought he saw the man's shadow twitch, just at the edge of peripheral vision. But each time he looked directly, the seat appeared empty. He pulled over at a small rest stop, the kind that sat abandoned most of the year, lights flickering weakly in the cold. He turned off the engine and the sudden silence was deafening, broken only by the soft hiss of the heater winding down and the distant eerie whistle of the wind. Tyler exhaled, trying to steady his shaking hands. "All right," he muttered more to himself than anyone else. "This is ridiculous. I'm just tired." But when he turned to check the passenger seat again, it was empty. Nothing. The seatbelt was still fastened. He blinked, heart hammering. Slowly, cautiously, he reached over and unbuckled it. Still no one there. A dry crunch of snow outside made him spin toward the window, but no figure waited in the cold, just the endless stretch of highway disappearing into gray mist. He forced himself back onto the road, every mile now a tense negotiation with the invisible presence he felt in the car. The heater hummed in a futile attempt to keep the chill at bay, his breath fogging in tight clouds in the air, and the song on the radio had shifted to static, faint whispers bleeding through the speaker. Tyler shook his head, trying to dispel the creeping fear. It had to be his imagination. He was exhausted, driving through hours of frozen nothingness. But the empty weight on the passenger seat, the fastened seatbelt, the occasional flicker in the rearview mirror that didn't align with anything behind him, told a different story. Something was there, or had been there, and his mind was no longer willing to ignore it. By the time night fully descended, the world outside the windshield had turned into a black void pierced by the car's headlights. Snow fell relentlessly, erasing the edges of the road, muffling sound until the tire's crunch was the only thing that reminded him he was moving at all. Every so often, he thought he caught movement just beyond the headlights. An arm, a leg, a shadow melting into the snow. He tried to rationalize, drifting branches, tricks of the light, the loneliness warping perception. But the sensation of eyes, unblinking and dark, tracking him from the seat beside him, was undeniable. He dared not glance too long, yet every time he looked, he saw the outline of a person seated, calm, silent. Hours slipped by in a fog of cold and terror, punctuated by the occasional hum of an engine somewhere in the distance, a car that passed, with no lights, no sound of doors, no driver in sight. Tyler's nerves frayed as the empty figure began to manifest more than just presence. It intruded on his senses. Whispers in static, fleeting touches of frost on his arm, a cold breath that didn't come from the vents. The radio sputtered a single drawn-out note and then silence. Tyler's hands gripped the wheel until knuckles whitened, his foot stiff over the gas pedal. He swerved slightly to avoid a patch of ice, and for a moment the passenger seat seemed to lurch toward him, closer than physically possible. His stomach turned. He was alone. And yet, he was not. The world had narrowed to the confines of the car, the dark highway, and the spectral figure beside him. Tyler's mind raced, trying to maintain logic, trying to convince himself that exhaustion had led to hallucinations. But when he glanced at the side mirror, the reflection of a man in thin frozen clothes walking along the shoulder appeared again, far closer than he could have approached on foot. Eyes locked on him. He jerked the wheel, heart in his throat, tires crunching over hidden ice, sending the car into a brief, terrifying slide. The man in the mirror didn't flinch, didn't move his legs faster, didn't waver. He simply stared, unwavering, and then, in a blink, he was gone. Tyler's breath came in ragged gasps. Every instinct screamed to stop, to abandon the road, but the snow offered no refuge, only miles of isolation. He pressed onward, aware that the passenger seat remained empty, the seatbelt still fastened. Each flicker of headlights, each shadow stretching across the snow-laden trees, felt alive with intent. He could hear the crunch of footsteps outside, the vehicle, even though the car was sealed tight. Whispers slithered through the cabin, a cold symphony that raised goosebumps along his arms. Then the sensation of being touched, a light, chilling tap on his shoulder made him whirl around, heart thundering. Nothing. Finally, he reached the outskirts of a small town, lights glimmering faintly through the snowfall. Relief surged and he slowed, shaking, hands trembling over the wheel. Parking near a gas station, he killed the engine and sat in the quiet, staring at the passenger seat. The seatbelt hung loosely now, swinging slightly, though no one had been there. Outside, a snow-covered figure seemed to watch from the edge of the parking lot before vanishing into the night. Tyler's phone buzzed with a message from a friend, meaningless words that felt distant, irrelevant, as though they belonged to a world he had left behind somewhere on that highway. He considered leaving the car, running into the warmth and lights, but a part of him froze. When he finally opened the door, the cold bit into him with renewed ferocity, and for a fleeting moment, he thought he saw the man standing just beyond the headlights, thin and shivering, expressionless, eyes dark, pits that seemed to draw the light from the world. Tyler slammed the door, backed the car into the lot and fled inside, heart hammering, breaths sharp and white in the cold air. But even as he shook, warming himself with coffee and the hum of fluorescent lights, the memory lingered. The seatbelt, the fleeting shadow, the whispers on the radio and the empty seat beside him. He left the next morning, the sky pale with dawn, convinced that he had imagined it all, or that the long highway had played cruel tricks on a tired mind. Yet miles later, when he glanced at the passenger seat, he noticed the seatbelt again, fastened, taut, as if holding someone who was not there. Tyler's stomach churned. He hadn't stopped, hadn't looked away long enough to miss anything. The snow outside sparkled under the morning sun, serene, unbroken. And still, a cold certainty pressed in. He had not driven alone. Not then, not ever, on that frozen stretch of highway. The feeling never left him. In every empty back seat, he saw, on the road afterward, in every flicker of headlights reflected in mirrors, he felt it. The silent passenger, watching, waiting, existing, just at the edge of reality. And sometimes, just sometimes, late at night when the heater hummed low and the wind rattled against his windows, he thought he heard a soft shuffle in the empty seat beside him, accompanied by the faintest whisper, "Drive." Even now, decades later, Tyler cannot say if it was real or imagined. He cannot explain the cold that lingers in his memory, the empty seatbelt, the man who walked through sub-zero snow without shivering, and he cannot shake the certainty that somewhere, on some frozen road, the passenger still rides. The sun had long sunk behind the jagged peaks of the Chugach Mountains, leaving the Portage Glacier Road carved into a narrow ribbon of black ice and shadow. Alex Mercer gripped the steering wheel of his aging pickup, the leather worn smooth by years of long-haul drives. Steam curled lazily from the thermos beside him, mingling with the frigid air that seeped in through the imperfect seals of the truck's doors. His breath formed small clouds as he exhaled, and the hum of the heater barely cut through the damp chill of the cabin. Radio static flickered in the background, then settled into a low drone as he flipped through the stations, finally landing on a soft, melancholic folk tune that reminded him of home, of a kitchen warm with light and the smell of his mother's coffee. He felt the familiar tug of fatigue in his shoulders, a reminder of the hundreds of miles he had traveled that week. Yet tonight something gnawed at him, a tension that had no origin but was as real as the cold biting through his jacket. The road ahead stretched endlessly, slick with frost, lined by dark forests that leaned like silent sentinels. Small patches of snow clung to the trees, reflecting the faint amber glow of his headlights, creating a rhythmic dance of shadows along the trunks. His tires crunched over thin layers of ice and gravel, the sound echoing off the mountains in a way that made the world feel both immense and suffocating. Alex adjusted the mirror and caught a fleeting glimpse of his own weary face, his eyes reddened from hours of staring at the dark. For a moment he thought he saw another figure sitting in the passenger seat, pale and indistinct, but when he blinked, nothing was there. He laughed softly at himself, chiding for the solitude of the road playing tricks on his mind. The fog from the glacier clung to the valley floor, rolling slowly across the highway, and for the first time that evening, he felt the slight, unsettling impression that the mountains themselves were watching. The entrance to the tunnel appeared, like a gash in the mountainside, swallowing the road in darkness. He slowed as he approached, his headlights piercing the jagged edges but doing little to reveal what lay beyond. The map had indicated the tunnel was barely a half-mile in length, a routine passage for travelers along this stretch. Alex shifted gears and entered, the tires squealing softly on the icy concrete. Immediately, the air changed, damp, heavy, almost liquid. The walls seemed to pulse faintly in the reflection of his lights, wet streaks gleaming like veins. A trickle of water dripped somewhere far above, echoing like a distant footstep. He shook off the sudden tension. Just an old tunnel, he told himself. Built decades ago, poorly lit. Nothing more. He hummed along with the radio, focusing on the familiar chords, forcing his eyes to stay on the narrow strip of road ahead. Minutes passed, or so he thought. The tunnel seemed to stretch far beyond its supposed length, the map's accuracy dissolving into a haze of concrete and shadow. He caught glimpses of movement along the walls, figures, fleeting and blurred, as though, trapped behind the thin veil of his headlights, they were human in outline but wrong somehow. Elongated limbs, faces that twisted and dissolved into darkness when he blinked. Alex slowed, a tight knot forming in his stomach. The heater rattled, a sudden cold gust sweeping through the cab as if the tunnel itself had exhaled. He turned his head trying to get a better look, and the reflection in the rearview mirror showed a shadow sitting in the back of the truck. Empty, Nothing there. The hair on his arm stood on end, his hands tightening on the wheel. Yet the rational part of him demanded logic, exhaustion, paranoia, imagination. He pressed on, a low hum of unease thrumming in his chest. Then came the whisper, barely audible, seeming to seep from the walls themselves. A soft sibilance like fingers tracing the concrete, speaking a language that made his skin crawl. He flicked the radio off. The song cut mid-verse, leaving the oppressive silence to echo. The sound returned, a scrape, a shuffle just beyond the reach of his headlights. He slammed the brakes, the tires skidding slightly on the ice, and peered through the windshield. The tunnel seemed to stretch infinitely, the exit nowhere in sight. Shadows gathered like smoke along the walls, dark and wet, pressing closer, moving in ways that made no sense. Alex's chest tightened. Every instinct screamed to turn around, yet the road offered no mercy. There was no shoulder, no escape. Only the tunnel and the unknown pressing against him from every direction. The further he drove, the more the tunnel contorted. Walls seemed to breathe, contracting and stretching just out of the corner of his vision. His lights flickered, briefly illuminating figures crouched at impossible angles along the edges of the road. The air tasted metallic, thick with an odor that was part rust, part decay. Every reflection in the mirrors became a phantom. Passengers that vanished when looked at directly. Shapes pressed flat against the concrete, disappearing into the shadows. Alex's mind raced, paranoia blossoming. He imagined the truck had slowed on its own, the engine whining in complaint. A scraping noise followed him, not consistent with tires on ice or the echo of dripping water. Something was moving with him, something patient, unseen, waiting. His pulse hammered in his ears. The tunnel had become a labyrinth, impossible and alive, swallowing time and light. He pressed the accelerator, but the truck seemed unresponsive, sluggish as if wading through water instead of asphalt. Hours, or so he would later swear, passed inside that impossible stretch. He saw the end of the tunnel, then it receded, stretching further than the eye could measure. Figures emerged closer now, human yet grotesquely elongated, faces torn and unreadable, bodies crouched in impossible positions. They didn't run, didn't react, they simply watched. A sudden scream, somewhere to his left, high-pitched and impossible, ricocheted along the walls. His head snapped toward it, eyes straining. The tunnel's surface was slick, reflecting the distorted lights like water, ripples forming and vanishing in the blink of an eye. The whispering returned, louder, closer, voices crawling along the concrete, hissing directly into his mind. "Stay, stay, stay," it said. A chorus of murmurs that merged with the pounding of his own heart. He slammed his hands against the wheel, turning sharply to the right, and the truck slid on ice, barely regaining traction as shadows closed. He felt their presence around him, inside the cab as well as without. A hand, or what he swore was a hand, tapped the glass of the side window, leaving a wet smear. The interior light flickered, revealing glimpses of figures in the back. Seat leaning closer, eyes black voids. Alex screamed, the sound swallowed by the oppressive dark. Tires screeched as he maneuvered through the widening corridor, walls bending in ways impossible for concrete, lengthening infinitely. He closed his eyes for a moment, took a ragged breath, and when he opened them, a phantom vehicle appeared, behind him in the rearview mirror, following without sound. The lights of the truck ahead were pale, flickering, reflecting in shapes that shouldn't exist. Every instinct to survive screamed, and yet his body felt leaden, unresponsive to reason. The figures lined the walls, pressing closer with each heartbeat, their forms dissolving into smoke and reconstituting closer than before. The final stretch, if it could be called that, arrived suddenly. The tunnel ended as abruptly as it had begun, spilling Alex into a snowy clearing beneath the dim glow of a half-moon. He skidded onto the icy road, heart hammering, sweat mingling with frost on his skin. His hands shook violently as he looked around. The truck's odometer was impossible. Hours had passed, or perhaps minutes, but the digital clock insisted that nearly 3 hours were gone. The radio came to life again, calm and normal, folk music drifting through the cabin like nothing had happened. He stared into the darkness, beyond the headlights. No figures, no phantoms, only the silent snow, the trees leaning like old, patient watchers. The tunnel behind him appeared normal, almost mundane, just a small, unassuming entrance in the mountain face. No wet walls, no elongating shadows. Nothing. Alex's pulse began to slow, though unease lingered like a shadow across his chest. He drove on cautiously, every sound of tires on ice, every gust of wind through the trees, a reminder of what might have happened. He reached the small gas station a few miles down the road, parked, and stepped out into the frigid night. Steam rose from his body, curling into the dark air. He tried to speak to the clerk, asked about the tunnel, anything. But the man shrugged, unfamiliar with the story, unaware of the impossible stretch of concrete that swallowed hours of time. Alex paid, refilled the truck, and left, the road winding behind him like a promise he did not trust. At home, he would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling the lingering press of the shadows at the edge of vision. And sometimes, in the corner of his eye, he would see it. A brief flicker, a shadow where there should be none, stretching longer than reason allowed. He would turn and nothing would be there, but the whispering would return in the back of his mind. Stay, stay, stay. Hours, minutes, years. He could not say. Time itself had been warped inside that tunnel, a place that should not exist. Yet Alex knew with a deep, unshakable certainty that somewhere beyond the end of any road, beyond the reach of lights and maps, the shadows waited, patient and eternal, ready to draw him back into the dark corridor that should have been only a half-mile long. He had escaped, for now, but the memory of the tunnel's impossible length and the faces pressed against the walls lingered, whispering questions with no answers. Did it happen, or had the road itself conjured the horror from the cold and isolation? He would never truly know. And sometimes late at night, when the wind howled and the trees groaned in the snow, he could swear he heard the faint, endless hum of headlights flickering somewhere far away, calling him back into the dark. The road stretched ahead in a ribbon of black through the endless whiteness, snow falling in fine crystalline sheets that blurred the edges of the world. Jamie's hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles pale under the warmth of the cracked leather, as the headlights carved twin swaths of light through the drifting flakes. Beside him, Lena sat curled in her parka, sipping from a thermos of coffee that steamed in the frigid air, the aroma sharp and bitter enough to wake the senses. Their small sedan hummed steadily along the Alaskan back road, tires crunching over layers of ice and snow. For hours it had been nothing but white, the forest a frozen, silent cathedral surrounding them, pine boughs heavy with frost, occasional snow-laden branches bowing like watchful sentinels. They had left Anchorage late in the afternoon, chasing the distant glint of a northern sunrise, and now twilight merged into a starless night. Jamie adjusted the radio dial, static snapping like ice across the speakers. The low hum of country music eventually gave way to static bursts, a voice flickering for only a second before disappearing, leaving the cabin in the soundless hum of the engine. Lena pressed her glove-covered hand against the window, watching. The snowflakes drift past, mesmerized by their delicate spiral, their soft landing upon the car hood. The world outside seemed far away, suspended as if time itself had slowed to watch them move. The couple had been on this road many times, a favorite route for spontaneous getaways, the kind that promised solitude and quiet. Jamie hummed along to the song on the radio, the warmth of the cup in his hand and Lena's presence making the isolation almost comforting. They joked about how their lives had shrunk to these small moments, coffee, cold hands, and endless miles of empty forest. Each mile marker they passed became a small victory, a sign that they were leaving the busy world behind, even if only temporarily. After nearly 3 hours of uninterrupted driving, Jamie finally pulled off the narrow shoulder, the tires sinking slightly into untrodden snow. "Let's stretch," he said, rubbing his neck, the frost nipping at exposed skin as they opened the doors. The wind rushed in, carrying a scent of pine and ice, chilling them instantly. Lena shivered, pulling her scarf tighter around her face, and together they stepped onto the untouched snow, boots sinking with soft, muffled crunches. As they walked a few steps from the car, Lena noticed something odd. A small square lying face down on the road's edge. Curious, she stooped, brushing the snow away with gloved hands to reveal a Polaroid photograph. The surface was slick with melting frost, and when she turned it over, her stomach sank. The image captured them standing exactly where they were beside their car just moments ago, but there had been no one else on the road. Jamie leaned closer, brow furrowed, but shook his head in disbelief. "Must be some kind of prank," he said, forcing a laugh, though it didn't reach his eyes. Lena felt a cold twinge in her gut, the kind that tells you something isn't right even before your mind fully comprehends it. They both looked around, the snow falling silently, trees looming like shadowed giants, yet no figure appeared, no footprints besides their own. They returned to the car, a shared unease settling like frost in the cabin. Jamie restarted the engine, the lights cutting again through the snow, and they continued down the road, neither speaking of the photo for a long while. The forest pressed in from either side, blackness heavy and absolute beyond the reach of the headlights. Snow muffled everything except for the soft crunch of tires on ice and the occasional sigh of wind through pine needles. Each glance in the rearview mirror made Lena's pulse quicken, a sense of being watched pressing at the edges of her awareness. Shadows seemed to pool behind the car, lingering just a second longer than they should, though she told herself it was merely fatigue, the cold and overactive imagination. Hours passed, the small digital clock blinking 1:42 a.m. when Jamie finally pulled into a roadside motel. The fluorescent lights flickered weakly in the snowfall, washing the building in a sickly pallor. They checked in quietly, the clerk's eyes briefly scanning them before returning to his crossword. The warmth of the room was immediate, wrapping them in a haze of relief. They unpacked the few belongings they had brought, hung coats, and finally allowed themselves to sink into the heavy blankets, heart still racing from the long drive and the strange photograph. Morning came with pale light bleeding through the blinds, snow still falling outside, though quieter now. Jamie reached for his phone on the nightstand and froze. Another Polaroid had appeared, lying atop the device as if it had materialized overnight. The image was unmistakable. Them, asleep in the motel room, bodies curled under blankets, faces peaceful in slumber. Neither had remembered taking a picture, no one had been there. Panic prickled the skin, a creeping dread that tightened around their chests. Jamie's hand shook slightly as he picked it up, flipping it over for any indication of origin, any clue that could explain it. Nothing. Lena's eyes darted to the window, the snow drifting lazily past the glowing street lamp outside. She whispered, "We need to get out of here." Jamie nodded, but both felt the inescapable heaviness of being hunted by something they couldn't see. The day stretched long and gray, and when evening fell, they drove again, attempting to put distance between themselves and the inexplicable phenomena. Yet the road seemed to twist, winding through the forest in ways that felt unfamiliar despite the maps and GPS. Headlights reflected back at them in odd angles, fleeting shadows flitting across the road edge. They passed stretches where the trees seemed unnaturally still, the wind absent. Even the sound of their own engine was muffled, as if swallowed by the snow itself. That night, another Polaroid appeared, this time tucked beneath the visor above Jamie's head. It showed them both standing on the side of the road, faces pale in the camera's flash, breath fogging in the cold. Behind them, a faint blur, human-shaped but impossible to place, hovered near the tree line. They stared at the image, horror tightening their throats. Neither remembered anyone being there, nor did either see the figure at any point while driving. Panic rose like wildfire, fingers white on the wheel as Jamie tried to rationalize, to find a mundane explanation. Lena pressed her hands to her ears, whispering that they needed to stop, to leave the car, to flee from this nightmare before it became something more tangible. The snow intensified as they drove, visibility shrinking to almost nothing. Every mile marker passed became a test of nerves, each shadow a potential threat. Occasionally, the radio crackled, carrying distorted voices, static laughter, words unrecognizable but somehow intimate, as if calling them by name. Jamie's eyes darted to the rearview mirror, seeing nothing but a flicker of movement in the corner of his vision made him swerve slightly, heart hammering. Lena gasped, clutching the seatbelt, staring into the darkness that now felt alive, oppressive. Something was following them, something patient, silent, waiting for a moment to emerge fully into view. They stopped briefly at another pull-off, the car engine idling as Jamie got out to check the tires. Lena stayed inside, peering into the dense forest. The trees stood like silent sentinels, their branches laden with snow. Yet among them a figure moved, or perhaps it was the shadows themselves. She couldn't tell. The world had begun to twist, the ordinary melting into something else entirely. When Jamie returned, he too sensed it. The unnerving, almost imperceptible pressure of eyes, though the space was empty. By the time they reached the next motel, exhaustion and fear tangled in equal measure. They collapsed into the bed, blankets pulled over their heads, trying to block the terror that seeped through the walls, through the floors, through the very air. Sleep came in fits and starts, punctuated by dreams that mirrored the Polaroids, themselves alone, frozen in snow, watched by unseen shapes. Every time they blinked, a shadow shifted just outside the window, and every time they exhaled, the air seemed thicker, almost holding them in place. Morning brought no comfort. The snow had stopped, leaving a silent world washed in white. Yet, on the nightstand, a new Polaroid waited. This one depicted them not standing but kneeling, hands pressed to the snow, faces twisted in terror, eyes wide and staring at something out of frame. They hadn't taken this photo. They hadn't moved in their sleep in this manner. And there, faintly visible in the background, was a form, indistinct but human enough, watching, waiting. Lena dropped the photograph, heart thundering, tears freezing on her cheeks. Jamie picked it up, stomach turning as the realization settled. Whatever this was, it had been following them all along, unseen yet ever present, recording moments they could not remember, moments that had already happened before they even knew to fear them. They left the motel without breakfast, driving in silence, the car lights carving into the morning fog. Every glance in the rearview mirror made them flinch. Each mile ahead felt like another invitation into the unknown. The forest seemed endless, stretching farther than maps could account for. And though the road appeared normal, every step forward felt like trespassing deeper into a world where the rules no longer applied. And though they drove, and though they left, neither could shake the certainty that somewhere in the snow-laden trees or just beyond the periphery of the headlights, something waited, something that had already seen them, had already captured them, and would continue to do so long after the road swallowed them whole. Even days later, when they returned home and unpacked, a Polaroid slid silently from a book on the shelf, showing them once again, this time inside their own living room, staring back at themselves, with wide, fearful eyes. They hadn't seen the photograph arrive. They hadn't touched the book. And somewhere faintly, almost imperceptibly, a sound whispered through the house, like the soft crunch of snow beneath unseen boots. The question remained, unanswerable, lingering like frostbite on the edges of reason. Who or what was taking the photos? And when they next blinked, would the next image already exist, waiting for them in the cold silence of an empty room? The wind had sharpened into a biting edge that day, slicing across the frozen expanse of the northern tundra like the hiss of a restless serpent. Mikhail tightened the straps on his parka, feeling the coarse wool against his skin as he adjusted, the fur-lined hood over his head. His breath curled into clouds, each one dissolving into the pale afternoon air. The sled dogs pawed at the snow, their excitement tempered by the monotony of the miles behind them. Tracks stretched endlessly across the whiteness, punctuated only by the occasional drifted mound of snow or a skeletal spruce swaying against the gray sky. Mikhail's hands, thick with calluses and warmth from well-worn mittens, gripped the sled handles as he listened to the rhythm of his dogs. A soft shuffle, then a panting woof, a clatter of harnesses against the runners. He hummed a low tune to himself, the melody carried by memories of home, a small cabin, the smell of pine, his mother's voice calling him in from the cold. The radio in his pack crackled faintly, but was mostly silent, leaving only the wind as company. Steam rose from the thermos he carried, a bitter, warming coffee that was more ritual than nourishment at this point. Every so often, a pair of red eyes would flicker in the distance, the reflection of a scavenging fox or perhaps a lone hare, and Mikhail would adjust his gaze before his mind could wander too far into speculation. The routine had become a meditation, a way to measure time across the unbroken white horizon. The landscape was deceptive in its quiet. Though the sky hung low and unchanging, the snow beneath the sled bore subtle signs of movement, undulations that seemed almost deliberate. Mikhail didn't think much of it. The tundra was full of minor anomalies, and experience taught him not to be startled by shadows cast on the ice. He hummed again, letting the familiar tune anchor him. The dogs sensed it too. Their tails wagged, slightly, their breathing falling into sync with his own. By midday, the monotony of the trail pressed in like a weight. The air was crystalline, and the silence so absolute it almost had a sound of its own. The faint scrape of the sled runners, the soft crunch beneath the dog's paws. Mikhail's thoughts drifted to his upcoming rest stop, a cluster of abandoned huts, their chimneys cold and hollow. He could already taste the warmth of tea and the ache of relaxation in his joints. The tundra stretched ahead, an unbroken swath of white, but something in the air made his stomach tighten. A tiny pulse of unease he almost ignored. Perhaps it was the way the wind shifted, or the fleeting flicker of movement out of the corner of his eye, a shadow crossing the snow, gone before he could pin it down. He shook his head and tightened his grip on the sled. Dogs noticed his tension immediately. They slowed slightly, ears pricked, waiting for cues. Then came the cry. It was soft at first, almost lost in the whistle of the wind, a sound that could have been mistaken for the yelp of a wounded animal or the mournful wail of the tundra itself. Mikhail froze, scanning the horizon. The dogs stiffened, hackles rising, a low whine escaping their throats. There it was again, a child's cry, high-pitched and desperate, echoing over the ice and snow. It seemed impossibly distant, yet undeniably close. "Who's there?" Mikhail called, his voice swallowed by the cold gusts. The cry stopped. Silence returned, a hollow, unnatural quiet that pressed against his ears. He shook his head and muttered, to himself, "Must be some animal, just an echo." But the dogs would not move forward. They crouched, whining, pawing at the snow, their harnesses taut with refusal. Mikhail tugged at the reins, urging them on, but they refused. And then the sound changed, it twisted. The crying transformed into laughter, faint at first, like wind chimes disturbed by a ghostly hand. The laughter rolled across the tundra, impossible in its clarity, resonant in the emptiness. It was a child's laughter, but distorted, hollow, almost metallic. Mikhail's chest tightened. The dogs backed away, ears flat, low growls vibrating from their throats. He felt it then, the tug of something unseen, a pressure in the air, as if the wind itself had conspired to trap him in a shifting illusion. Mikhail's mind raced. He tried logic. Perhaps the tundra carried voices differently in certain hollows. Perhaps the snow amplified echoes. Yet every rational thought collided with instinct. He could feel eyes on him, a gaze that slid over his shoulders and settled at the nape of his neck. He looked back, but nothing was there. Only the endless white, broken by the occasional gray, drift or distant spruce. The laughter grew louder, circling him, bouncing across the ice as if mocking his disbelief. He tightened his hands around the sled's grips and forced the dogs to step forward. They moved reluctantly, whining, noses low. The cry returned, closer now, cutting through the whine of the wind. Mikhail's stomach lurched as he strained to locate it, realizing that the sound was moving with him, shifting, always just at the edge of perception. He glimpsed something in the distance, a dark shape standing among the snowdrifts. A child maybe, small and pale, too still to be natural. His heart hammered, each beat echoing in his ears like the tolling of a bell. The landscape became alien. Shadows stretched and bent in impossible angles. Mikhail's breath steamed furiously in the cold, mingling with the fog that rose from the dog's flanks. Every step forward was measured and heavy. He could see footprints now, small and deep, leading in circles. And yet, no tracks of any child accompanied them. The wind carried whispers, tiny, urgent, overlapping syllables he could not decipher. The laughter was everywhere now, inside his mind as well as outside, rolling through him like a tide of ice. Suddenly the sled tipped. A runner snagged a hidden drift, hurling Mikhail forward. He landed hard on the snow, scraping his hands and knees, the dogs yelping in panic. He scrambled back, adrenaline coursing, scanning the horizon. The figure, or something, was closer, now. He could see its form, indistinct, shifting, like smoke shaped into a child. No face, only an impression of youth and innocence, and yet the sense of malice was undeniable. The laughter shifted into a shrill scream, echoing off the frozen hills, reverberating through Mikhail's skull. He urged the dogs forward with renewed desperation, whipping the sled runners against the snow, ignoring the stinging cut on his palm. The figure mirrored him, moving impossibly fast, always at the edge of vision. The tundra seemed to stretch infinitely, the horizon folding in on itself, snowdrifts morphing into grotesque shapes, skeletal trees stretching toward him with gnarled fingers. Mikhail's lungs burned, each gasp of air sharp and bitter. The cries of the dogs mingled with the laughter, creating a discordant symphony of terror that pressed against his mind. A sudden shriek of wind tore through the plain, almost like a voice. "Go back!" Mikhail's heart nearly stopped. He could see the sled itself lifting, shifting beneath him, shadows curling under the runners as if the snow was alive. The child, or the apparition, stood ahead now, no longer small but looming, a void of impossible darkness shaped like innocence. He swerved sharply, the dogs straining against his commands, the cold cutting into his face, fingers numb but gripping. The laughter reached a crescendo, piercing, cruel, and he realized it was not laughter anymore, but a chorus of voices, thousands of them, overlapping, echoing, whispering promises of oblivion. The sled skidded. Mikhail lost control for a moment. Snow sprang into his eyes. He could see nothing, yet the presence was undeniable, circling, shifting, pressing against him, threatening to draw him into the frozen void. He felt the brush of air like a hand against his neck, soft and icy. His mind screamed, but he forced the dogs onward through the frozen tunnel that the tundra had become, pushing past shapes and whispers. The wind tore at his hood. Snow stung his eyes, but he forced his body forward, legs pumping, arms raw from holding the reins. Then, as suddenly as it began, the voices stopped. Silence swallowed the tundra whole, leaving only the soft crunch of the sled and the panting of the dogs. Mikhail collapsed against the snow, trembling, trying to catch his breath. His heart hammered, the echo of laughter and screams still vibrating in his bones. He dared not look back, but when he finally forced his eyes to scan the horizon, the figure, or what he thought was a figure, was gone. The tracks in the snow were only his own, and those of the sled dogs. The wind carried nothing but the emptiness of the frozen plain. He forced the dogs to a slow pace, eyes darting to every drift and shadow. The frost clung to his lashes, icicles forming on his parka. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time felt meaningless in the aftermath of what he had witnessed. There were no footprints, no cries, nothing but the unbroken expanse of ice and snow. Mikhail spoke aloud, calling the child, calling for the wind to answer, but silence remained. Night fell. He reached the abandoned huts, the pale glow of twilight reflecting off the snow, casting long, distorted shadows. He tied the dogs and sank into the shelter's icy interior, wrapping his parka tightly, the thermos of coffee long cold. He stared out into the dark tundra, listening. And then, faintly, almost imperceptibly, a sound rose on the wind. A distant, high-pitched laughter carried lightly across the frozen expanse, echoing like a memory that should not exist. Mikhail shivered, pulling the hood over his face. He did not move. He did not speak. He did not know whether to fear the return or the silence that had replaced it. Somewhere out there, across the unbroken ice and snow, the cry had vanished into the wind, leaving only the haunting question: had it ever truly been alone? The dogs lay quietly, uneasy, ears twitching. Mikhail pressed his forehead against the frosted windowpane, trying to convince himself of reason. But he could still hear it, faintly, in the corners of his mind. A sound that belonged to the tundra, yet to nothing living he had ever known. And deep in his chest he felt a pulse of dread that refused to fade. Something had been there, and perhaps in the endless white, it still was. Alaska's roads stretch endlessly into silence, but silence is not always safe. Sometimes the cold hides more than it preserves, and sometimes the road remembers what we try to forget. If you've ever driven on these lonely highways, you know the difference between quiet and something watching.